Churchill's conversion was met with a measure of scepticism. After only 4 years in Parliament, he deserted the Conservatives and crossed the floor to join the radical Liberals around the dynamic leader David Lloyd George.
The ambitious young politician gained both promotion and a wife. Full Home Secretary, 35-year-old Winston Churchill, agreed to the deployment of a platoon of Scots Guards. He was unable to resist the temptation to go along himself. In January 1911, the streets of London rang with gunfire as police and soldiers besieged a gang of anarchists. Rare newsreel reveals how a bullet missed Winston Churchill's head by inches. And by the evening, this film was being shown in a movie theatre in the centre of London.
I watched agape as the man who was later to become my boss at Scotland Yard was shot at.
Aged only 36, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. When World War I broke out, Churchill sent the Royal Navy to invade Turkey, Germany's ally to the south. A premature naval assault failed. 46,000 soldiers of the British Empire were slaughtered at Gallipoli. Churchill had described the operation as a gamble, and the government had approved it. Once it failed, he was forced to resign as Lord of the Admiralty. He sank into a deep depression.
With the hostilities ended, Winston was brought back into the cabinet as Secretary of State for War.
Lloyd George put Churchill in charge of the War Ministry. While Lloyd George was away at the peace negotiations, Churchill committed British troops to fight with the anti-Bolshevik armies in Russia. It was another disastrous mistake.
Ich werde mit eisernem Besen auskehren und alle diejenigen, die ausschließlich wegen ihrer roten oder schwarzen Gesinnung und zur Unterdrückung aller nationalen Bestrebungen in Amt und Würden sitzen, hinausfegen. Und deshalb tu dir gut daran, diese mitternächtige Stunde den Ungeist der Vergangenheit, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Und dazu wollen wir euch
Parmi les fanatiques. Quand ce soir de 1933, Adolf Hitler est nommé chancelier d'Allemagne, une nouvelle fois, il ne veut pas travailler comme son rôle l'exigerait.
Mussolini was determined to change the nature of Italians and make them dynamic and instinctively aggressive.
Noi crediamo che l'Italia, sotto la guida del Littorio, inquadrata in tutte le sue formazioni rivoluzionarie, attingerà i suoi destini, arriverà al benessere, alla potenza e alla gloria.
It still amazes me to realize that even though the public knew that he had had polio, they had no idea, really most people, that he could not walk on his own power.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, having received more than 2/3 of all the delegates voting, I proclaim him the nominee of this convention for President of the United States.
Election night proved how badly Americans wanted change, as Roosevelt pulled away by more than 7 million votes.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time.
On January the 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor.
Letter of appointment. In the name of the Reich, I appoint Herr Adolf Hitler to be German Chancellor. Berlin, January the 30th, 1933. President von Hindenburg.
Now, German nation, give us 4 years, then you can judge and sentence us. Adolf Hitler, February the 10th, 1933. I cannot divest myself of my faith in my people and stand firmly by the conviction that the hour will come at last when the millions who curse us today will stand by us, and with us will hail the new, hard-won and painfully acquired German nation that we have created together, the new German Reich of greatness and power, glory and justice. Amen. Adolf Hitler, Reich Chancellor.
Hitler had no emotional connection to the church. He thought the Christian religion was an outdated, hypocritical, people-ensnaring institution.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
With the so-called Enabling Act, Hitler demands extraordinary powers for himself and his government, thus paving the way for a dictatorship.
The present state of affairs in Germany causes me to resign my position in the Prussian Academy of Sciences.
Leading Social Democrats have been placed in protective custody, among them former Reichstag President Goebbels.
And Winston had no particular bias against him, except for his attitude to the Jews. Mr. Churchill spoke at length on the subject and wanted to know why the Führer was so violent about the Jews.
If someone accuses me of not having brought in the ordinary court for judgment, I can only say, at this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German nation, and thus the German people's supreme judge.
Having spent several summers in the Rhineland during his youth, he saw through Hitler, describing him as a wild and a nut.
After the meeting in Venice, the relationship between Hitler and Mussolini initially remained distant.
He was like a gramophone that only plays 7 notes, and once played, starts all over again. Benito Mussolini.
The SS, which was formerly still affiliated with the SA, is rewarded for its murderous service.
In view of the great services of the SS, particularly in connection with the occurrences of June the 30th, 1934, I hereby promote them to a self-contained organization within the NSDAP.
A law has been made. Hitler will remain the leader of the German people for life.
As early as May 1933, Hitler, who is fascinated by cars and technology, issued a program of motorway construction, which was to create a dense network of 4-lane roads across Germany. There are about 1,500 kilometers of motorway under construction in autumn 1934. Hitler had publicly demanded that the German automobile industry develop an economical and inexpensive passenger car.
Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative leader, became Prime Minister of the national government in 1935, but made no attempt to bring Winston back as a minister.
In 1935, Britain and Germany had agreed on a naval treaty. Germany is allowed to expand its navy to 35% of British strength.
The civilization of the past 100 years, with its startling industrial changes, has tended more and more to make life insecure. This social security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens.
On the 3rd of October, 1935.
Italy conquered Ethiopia.
The Philippines was once a U.S. colony, but in 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed a law making it a semi-independent commonwealth, promising complete independence in 10 years.
Senor Quezon, I congratulate you.
History is replete with examples of men who have risen to power by employing stern, grim, wicked, and even frightful methods, but who, nevertheless, when their life is revealed as a whole, have been regarded as great figures whose lives have enriched the story of mankind. So may be the case with Hitler. Winston Churchill.
Hitler had not revealed his rearmament plans or the existence of his new Luftwaffe at that stage, but his intention to rebuild Germany's armed forces was an open secret.
In 1936, they seize on British and French political weakness to reoccupy the Rhineland, stripped from Germany after World War I. Germany has already started to rebuild her armed forces in secret, reveals the initial extent of her rearmament plans.
Roosevelt's Republican opponent in the 1936 presidential race was Alfred Landon, the governor of Kansas. Encouraged by a growing anti-Roosevelt press, Landon campaigned against regimentation and the expensive New Deal.
In August 1936, the 11th Olympic Games of the modern era are held in Berlin.
Our streets have changed for the better recently.
There were swastikas hanging from every street corner.
The opening ceremony was held on August 1st at the newly built sports stadium.
The Führer and Reich Chancellor is leaving the Olympic Stadium, booms from the loudspeakers. Everyone rises to give the Nazi salute.
To Adolf Hitler, the games were the ultimate propaganda tool. Race day, with Hitler at the racecourse. German rowers earned gold medals in the first 5 races of the day, to the delight of the Führer. The host nation had won more medals than any other.
We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better. And most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything.
On October the 18th, 1936, Adolf Hitler issues the Order to Implement the 4-Year Plan. From 1937, the commissioner for the 4-Year Plan, Hermann Göring, creates the third largest German industrial group with his own Hermann Göring Reichsworks.
At his second inaugural, Roosevelt talked about all the things his New Deal policies had yet to accomplish.
I see millions of families trying to live on income so meager that the pall of family disaster hangs over them day by day. I see millions whose daily lives in city and on farm continue under conditions labeled indecent by a so-called polite society half a century ago. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. I see in America a great cultural and educational opportunity for all its people. An America where the wheels of trade and private industry continue to turn to make the goods for America. I think that it is the destiny of this American generation to point the road to the future for all the world to see.
Starts in July 1937. The full-scale Japanese invasion makes quick progress in the north.
Japan was marching through China.
(1937). It was inherently a law of its own. The law governing special holidays for the state capital Berlin and the movement capital of Munich. It was determined that September the 2nd would be a holiday for Munich, and September the 28th for Berlin. Thus motivated, millions poured into the streets.
Without a declaration of war and without warning or justification, civilians, including vast numbers of women and children, are being ruthlessly murdered with bombs from the air.
Many in America want to remain isolationist.
The year 1937 is the quietest of Hitler's 12-year reign. The people in Hitler's Reich enjoy their lives. But from 1938, the military version of the Beetle, the so-called Kübelwagen, and other military equipment. The rest is propaganda, which even has an effect in faraway America.
Thousands and thousands of shiny little beetles purring along from the Baltic to Switzerland and from Poland to France, with father, mother, and up to 3 kids packed inside and see their fatherland for the first time through their own windshield. New York Times, July the 3rd, 1938.
Hitler's name stands for the achievements and successes of the regime in the mid-1930s, and this is what the majority of the population believes. Within 3 years, his genius has achieved a booming economy, the elimination of unemployment, and the restoration of peace and order.
No one who saw Franklin Roosevelt in his second term could describe him as a defeated man. The court and Congress had refused to ratify some of his programs. His critics had grown more numerous and more bold. but his New Deal policies had helped to stabilize the economy, and looking towards the future, FDR was optimistic.
Of the facts themselves, there was no doubt. He had restored to Germany her self-respect and recreated orderliness out of the chaos and distress which had followed her defeat in 1918. Neville Henderson, British ambassador to Germany.
What surprised me was that most Germans, as far as I could see, didn't seem to mind that their personal freedoms had been taken away.
The Führer had at this time something like the power of Napoleon after Austerlitz and Jena. Winston Churchill, member of the British Parliament. Apart from his resolve to bring all Teutonic races into the Reich, as so plainly described in Mein Kampf, Hitler had two reasons for wishing to absorb the Austrian Republic. It opened both the door of Czechoslovakia and the more spacious portals of southeastern Europe to Germany. Winston Churchill, the Second World War.
Führer's order, March the 11th, 1938, 8:45 p.m. Operation Otto. To avoid further bloodshed in Austrian towns, the march of the German armed forces into Austria will commence at daybreak on March the 12th. Adolf Hitler.
On Friday, the 11th of March, 1938, it was 7:45 in the evening when the announcer suddenly interrupted. Kurt Schuschnigg said that in order to avoid bloodshed, he would capitulate to Hitler's wishes. He ended his speech with the words, "God protect Austria."
His delight in mingling with school children was grist for the Nazi propaganda mill.
Thursday, March the 23rd, 1938. He had come to Memel in the armored ship Deutschland with a whole fleet. His words were uplifting.
On March the 25th, 1938, Hitler begins the last election campaign of his life. Hitler wants to confirm the annexation of Austria in a referendum. "99.75% have voted for the Anschluss."
Swastika flags flew on the streets of Sudeten German districts and cities.
Hitler demanding the Sudeten German portions of Czechoslovakia.
September the 28th, 1938. Tomorrow, a meeting in Munich between Hitler, Daladier, Chamberlain and Mussolini.
8 months before, Chamberlain had rejected a proposal by Roosevelt for an international conference to save the peace.
On the 29th of September 1938, Britain, France, Germany and Italy signed an agreement that Hitler could have the Sudetenland in return for a formal declaration that he had no further territorial ambitions.
Later, Mussolini would recall with pride how Chamberlain had licked his boots.
Churchill denounced it as an unmitigated defeat. Churchill was obsessed with the Nazis, but his warnings went unheeded. His credibility had been eroded by his own excessive rhetoric.
Chamberlain flew back to London to wave his piece of paper and declare that he had secured peace in our time. Winston's relations with the government were now as bad as they had ever been. He was also under attack by much of the press and public for his open criticism of Chamberlain, who was regarded as the man who had saved his country from war.
As Hitler entered German-speaking Czechoslovakia, Churchill condemned those leaders who had thrown a small nation to the wolves.
The increasingly heady atmosphere of the days of the occupation has already ebbed away. Nevertheless, one has to say that National Socialism has been accepted everywhere. Soon after the occupation, we received letters from relatives of refugees, mostly comrades, that clearly showed that they too had been convinced by National Socialism.
As I talked with him, I could not but think of Joan of Arc. He is distinctly a mystic. He is a teetotaler.
The genius of the Führer and his determination not to shrink even in the face of war have again achieved victory without the use of force.
November the 10th, 1938. Meeting in the Ministry of Aviation.
Goering again openly expressed his reluctance, but nevertheless issued an abundance of repulsive regulations. Things like Jews should not visit theatres, museums, and beach resorts. Goering said himself in the meeting he wouldn't want to live in Germany as a Jew anymore.
Around 120,000 German and Austrian Jews leaving their homeland by the beginning of the Second World War.
Hitler is convinced that Great Britain and France want to avoid a war. Will he go further?
With the growing threat from both East and West, America becomes concerned. In January 1939, President Roosevelt asked the Congress for $552 million to start a program of rearmament. In January and May of the following year, the President calls for about $3.4 billion to boost national defense.
In January 1939, the hope that Mussolini would side with Britain and France brought the British Prime Minister on a mission to Rome, but Mussolini's price was too high.
On the 13th of February 1939, Hitler tells a few confidants that he intends to take action against the Czechs in mid-March.
The Czech president, Emil Hácha, was summoned to Berlin.
For 3 hours, Hitler conducted a discussion with the president of Czechoslovakia. We all knew that it was about war or peace. Suddenly the door opened, Hitler rushed out and proclaimed,
"So people, good news. Hácha has signed the agreement. I will go down as the greatest German in history."
Christa Schröder, Hitler's private secretary.
In March 1939, the Germans occupied Prague. Churchill was proved right. Hitler could not be appeased.
It is generally assumed that after the annexation of Memel, he has to move on to the settlement demands with Poland, primarily the takeover of Danzig and the corridor.
Hitler demanded that Poland surrender the Baltic seaport of Danzig with its strategic corridor to the sea, a prize lost by Germany in 1920 at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Poland did not yield.
March the 31st, 1939. I have to inform the House that during that period, in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. They have given the Polish government an assurance to that effect. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister.
But no one who understood the situation could doubt that it meant in all human probability a major war in which we should be involved. Winston Churchill, member of the House of Commons.
Mussolini's foreign minister, Count Ciano, arrived in Berlin to sign a full-scale military alliance with Hitler. The German occupation of Prague 2 months earlier had caught Mussolini unawares. Briefly, he had considered switching to the side of Britain and France, but it made more sense to stay with the stronger side.
In 1939, the NSDAP has 5.3 million members. Its mass organizations such as the SA, the Hitler Youth, and the German Labour Front are responsible for another 30 million Germans, a nation marching in step towards war.
What is Herr Hitler going to do? Is he going to try to blow up the world or not? The world is a very heavy thing to blow up. June the 28th, 1939.
August the 13th, 1939. Hitler was completely set on war.
The British are guilty of everything. The Poles have a serious lesson to learn. The democracies are inferior to Germany and will never fight.
Is Germany's non-aggression pact with the USSR in 1939. Signed by the German and Soviet foreign ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, this treaty opens the way for the forthcoming German invasion of Poland.
Stalin had cut a deal with Hitler to carve up Eastern Europe. Hitler got most of Poland. Stalin got the Baltic states.
In these hours, I knew that if war came, and who could doubt its coming, a major burden would fall upon me.
On August the 31st, he summoned the Polish ambassador and complained to him about provocative Polish attacks, all of which had been staged by German special forces.
On September the 1st, 1939, Germany starts World War II with her invasion of Poland.
21st, 1939, Friday, 7th day of mobilization, 6:30 a.m. Border overrun everywhere. 10 a.m., the Führer's Reichstag speech.
I have once more put on that coat that was most sacred and dear to me. I will not take it off again until victory is secured, or I will not survive the outcome.
Now we are at war.
And entered the next room, where Hitler was sitting at his desk, while Ribbentrop stood at the window. I remained some distance from Hitler's desk, slowly translated the ultimatum of the British government. When I finished, after a while, he turned to Ribbentrop.
What now?
Ribbentrop replied with a quiet voice,
I suppose the French will issue an identical ultimatum within the hour.
As my job was now finished, I left and told those waiting outside, in 2 hours, a state of war will exist between England and Germany. Goering turned to me and said,
if we lose this war, then may heaven have mercy on us.
When France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September the 3rd,
Neville Chamberlain broadcast to the nation.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us.
United and in a mood of quite unjustified optimism, the British army set off for France.
Italy declared war against France and Britain. Now British Prime Minister Chamberlain knew there would be no peace in our time.
Parliament blamed Chamberlain for the defeat. His government was on the verge of collapse. In search of a successor to lead a new coalition government, Chamberlain summoned the old appeaser, Lord Halifax, and the old warrior, Winston Churchill.
He did appear to be a man who knew about how to fight a war, knew about grand strategy. He wanted to defeat Hitler. He was a man who had seen earlier than most that Hitler was evil. So in many ways, he was better qualified for the job, even though at the same time, there were many people who were really horrified at the thought of this wayward and unstable man taking over.
Churchill loves war. He makes no secret of it, even boasts about it. Joe L. Sawyer, bomber pilot, Royal Air Force.
The United States proclaimed its neutrality.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or to close his conscience.
September the 28th, 1939. Warsaw has finally fallen.
The fiery curtain to Act I of World War II was raised.
Some 16,000 members of the German armed forces die, and 30,000 are wounded, 68,000 dead and 130,000 wounded on the Polish side.
The enslavement of Poland further united the two extreme proponents of totalitarian violence. SS units killed 60,000 Jews and members of the Polish ruling class.
Millions of Americans were more interested in Joe DiMaggio and the New York Yankees taking 4 straight from Cincinnati in the World Series than they were in the deadly games being played in Europe and Asia, where aggressors were out to take all.
In addition to the free city of Gdansk, western parts of Poland are annexed and added to the Greater German Reich. From October 16, 1939 onwards, the remaining central Poland is subject to the authority of a German civil administration as a general government.
Soon, Russia attacked Little Finland. The valiant Finns fought the Russians to a standoff.
A nation of 35 millions fell into the merciless grip of those who sought not only conquest, but enslavement, and indeed extinction for vast numbers.
Smashing blitzkrieg tactics. The heroic Poles fought the invaders with a courage that was phenomenal, but futile against overwhelming odds. In the spring of 1940, the Nazi war machine rolled into Denmark and into Norway.
Winston entered number 10 to face the greatest crisis in Britain's history.
Winston Churchill said that all his past life had been preparation for a moment of destiny.
He was a man of genius, and like all men of genius, there are dark patches and there are bright patches.
There was this invaluable streak of, some would say, ruthlessness, some would say vulgarity.
Churchill was often accused throughout his life of being an opportunist, and as Lord Beaverbrook once said, he'd held every opinion on every question. There appeared to be a sense in which he could just change his mind all the time, and that in that sense he really did appear to be an unscrupulous and unprincipled adventurer. On the other hand, there were, I think, certain things that Churchill did believe in all the time. He did believe in the greatness of Britain. He did believe in the British Empire. He did believe in a certain sort of parliamentary democracy.
On May the 10th, 1940, the day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister,
Hitler, with his Eastern Front secured by Stalin, launched his blitzkrieg to the west. The British were driven from the continent.
Holland was brutally crushed. In one deadly swoop, the Nazis overran Belgium, Luxembourg, and smashed across the French frontier. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war. The aggressors struck with massive air power, with armor, with mobile artillery. Strike fast, strike hard with overwhelming, ruthless force. What remained of the French army retreated to Mediterranean ports for evacuation to North Africa, to live to fight another day and help win the victory.
Less than 3 weeks later, Churchill gave the order to evacuate the British army, trapped by the advancing Germans against the sea at Dunkirk. Now Britain stood alone. Churchill had nothing to hurl at the enemy, save words of defiance.
We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Paris, undefended, fell like a ripe plum into the Nazi basket of conquests.
I heard the laughter of her heart in every street cafe.
Hitler had succeeded in conquering most of Europe.
Hitler signed an armistice with France and became master of all Western Europe. He could now concentrate on the destruction of his greatest adversary, England.
For Hitler, victory had lanced a boil. Germany's defeat in the First World War had been avenged.
Et de combat, la Pologne, le Danemark, la Norvège, la Belgique, la Hollande et la France sont envahis.
Nikita Khrushchev, later Russia's prime minister, recalled Stalin's reaction to Hitler's lightning victories.
I remember being with Stalin. He was extremely nervous. He was racing around, cursing like a cab driver. He cursed the French.
Hitler could not defeat Britain in the air, but he determined to break its will. In 1940, at the height of the London Blitz, German bombs killed 7,000 civilians in one single month.
The Battle of Britain was raging. If Hitler wanted to conquer Britain, he needed command of the skies. Throughout the summer of 1940, the struggle for air supremacy was played out above the English Channel in southeast England.
July 1940. The Führer is greatly puzzled by Britain's persistent unwillingness to make peace. He sees the answer in Britain's hope in Russia.
On July the 19th, 1940, in a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler made his final plea for peace to Britain. Churchill and the British were not interested. Hitler retreated to the mountains of Obersalzberg. Here, the summer before, he'd been dreaming up his pact with Stalin. Now he suspected him. At the end of July, he announced to his generals the result of weeks of agonized reflection.
31st of July 1940, 11:30, Berghof. Führer concludes Russia is the factor on which Britain is relying the most. Something must have happened in London. The British were completely down. Now they have perked up again.
On the 15th of September, the Royal Air Force inflicted such damage on the Luftwaffe
The RAF defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain
that Hitler postponed his invasion plans.
Hitler's adjutant, Major Gerhard Engel, noted in his diary,
Führer visibly depressed. He conveys the impression that at the moment he does not know how things should proceed.
The first peacetime draft in American history. They finally enacted the Selective Service Act in September 1940.
Within a year, our army grew to 1,500,000 men. It would continue to grow to a peak strength of 8 million. They had to be trained to combat hardness if they were to meet and destroy an enemy already toughened and blooded by combat. General Leslie McNair was charged with directing the gigantic training program. General Somerville was appointed Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of supply. His was to be a superhuman task.
The collaborationist Vichy regime in France yields to Japanese pressure and in September 1940 allows the Japanese to occupy northern Indochina. The arrival of Japanese troops in northern Indochina positions her to threaten Thailand and in the long term Malaya. On September the 27th, 1940. On this date in Berlin, the Axis Pact is signed for Italy by Count Ciano, for Germany by von Ribbentrop, and for Japan by the Japanese ambassador in Berlin. The pact demands mutual assistance in the event of any of the signatories is attacked and accords Japan primacy in Asia.
Though FDR, he was constrained by a pledge given on the eve of his third election for the presidency in 1940.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
A popular promise made in the pursuit of power. Now he had to live with the consequences.
On November the 12th, 1940, the Russian Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, arrived in Berlin at Hitler's invitation. Molotov was given the full Nazi fanfare. Hitler's purpose in summoning Molotov was to offer Russia a share in the spoils of victory. But Stalin wasn't interested in joining Hitler's war, or speculative carve-ups of the British Empire. When Molotov reported back to Moscow on the talks in Berlin, Stalin realized that Hitler was turning against him. He believed that Hitler either had to beat Churchill or make a deal with him before he could think of turning against Russia.
In early December, the White House announced that the president and his principal assistant, Harry Hopkins, were going to the Caribbean on a vacation.
Why is the President of the United States going off on a fishing trip, virtually incommunicado?
Time was running out. Churchill decided to make one last desperate personal appeal to the frustratingly elusive American president.
Churchill always said it was the most important letter he wrote in his life, not only to Roosevelt, but to send Roosevelt a completely honest, detailed account. I think the letter's some 20 pages, exactly what Britain's position was, which meant exactly what our weaknesses were.
On December 9th, 1940, a seaplane touched down in Caribbean waters. Aboard, the 20-page letter that would decide the fate of the British Empire. Franklin Roosevelt read it over and over again without comment. Churchill's message to the U.S. president was simple. Britain was bankrupt. After battling for 5 months to prevent a Nazi invasion, she could no longer pay for the weapons she needed to stave off defeat.
Suddenly, one day, he gets with Hopkins and he starts talking about what if we were to give them the ships and planes and to lend it to them.
It was classic Roosevelt. No one was consulted, not even Henry Stimson, the 74-year-old New York banker Roosevelt had nominated a year earlier to be his Secretary of War. 3 weeks after his return from the Caribbean, the president made an appeal for public support on the radio.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
It was a brilliant political maneuver. By leasing rather than selling the British the equipment, he avoided a congressional vote of authorization he might well have lost. Roosevelt was well aware of the political risk of tying his presidency to the British cause. He needed reassurance that Winston Churchill was the right man to carry both their burdens.
Roosevelt could not be sure what all those stirring and wonderful speeches that unto this hour give us gooseflesh might have just been classic Churchillian bombast on the road to disaster.
In early 1941, he told Politburo members,
"We must cherish no illusions. Fascist Germany is clearly preparing for an attack on the Soviet Union. Why does Hitler want to make an agreement with England? Because he wants to avoid war on two fronts."
Throughout 1940, Hitler had hardly mentioned the Jews, but on January the 30th, 1941, in his traditional speech marking the anniversary of the Nazis' rise to power, he repeated a chilling threat he'd first made before war broke out.
Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
In North Africa, British forces were fighting an Italian drive upon Egypt.
3rd of March 1941. The forthcoming campaign will lead to a showdown between two different ideologies. The Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia must be eliminated.
And having made up his mind to attack Russia for tactical reasons, the original and biggest idea of all was reasserting itself: the ideological struggle against Jews and Bolsheviks.
It had come down to one great battle which would shape the future of civilization.
On March 11th, 1941, House Resolution 1776 passed. In a White House ceremony that evening, Franklin Roosevelt signed Lend-Lease into law.
On Easter Tuesday in April 1941, 180 Luftwaffe bombers attacked Belfast. Their target was the Harland and Wolff shipyard, a vital base for the Royal Navy.
Nazi and fascist troops smashed into the Balkans, into Greece. The Greeks fought with their traditional courage, but were overwhelmed by the Nazi tidal wave. 1940 was a black year for what was left of the free world.
On April the 13th, 1941, he moved to protect his back, signing a pact with Hitler's ally, Japan. Stalin was thrilled with his coup and got happily tipsy with the Japanese foreign minister, Matsuoki. But he was still following his double strategy. As he said goodbye to Matsuoki, the German military attaché in Moscow was present. Stalin told him,
We must remain friends, and you must now do everything to that end. We will stay friends with you, whatever happens.
In April 1941, Stalin received his second letter from Winston Churchill. Churchill told him the British had received intelligence reports of German troop movements, which could only be preparations for a Nazi attack on Russia. Stalin was instantly suspicious, not of Hitler, but of Churchill. He told his army chiefs,
Britain is threatening us with the Germans, and threatening the Germans with the Soviet Union.
Then on May the 10th, 1941, in one of the war's strangest moments, Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, took off from Germany in a Messerschmitt fighter, flew across the North Sea, and parachuted to the ground in Scotland.
According to Winston Churchill, it was later that evening that he was first informed that a parachutist in custody appeared to be Rudolf Hess. Instead of welcoming the event as a propaganda coup, Churchill at once ordered that the matter should be treated with the utmost secrecy. Was it that Hess had in his possession material that would have incriminated influential people in Britain in a plot to oust Churchill and make peace with Hitler? The answer may never be known.
It is possible to piece together how Churchill's message and Hess's flight began to lead Stalin towards a conspiracy theory.
On the one hand, Churchill sends us a personal message in which he warns us about Hitler's aggressive intentions. And on the other hand, the British meet Hess, who is undoubtedly Hitler's confidant. What is the conclusion then?
In Stalin's eyes, Churchill's warning was deliberately designed to provoke a war between Germany and Russia.
Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his war cabinet were preparing for the onslaught of the Nazi invasion of Britain.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age.
FDR tried to inch the country towards engagement. The previous summer, he supplied Britain with a few mothballed destroyers, though not enough to influence the course of the war. Roosevelt needed time to think, to find a way through the fog of war.
Throughout May and June, intelligence reports gave warning after warning of imminent German attack. Stalin dismissed every one of them as part of the great conspiracy to provoke him. On June the 18th, Stalin's two top generals, Zhukov and Timoshenko, pleaded with him for a full alert. Stalin reminded them that Hitler could not attack without first doing a deal with Britain. June the 22nd, millions of German troops gathered within striking distance of Russia's borders. Operation Barbarossa, as it was now called, was scheduled for 10 days' time.
The largest invasion in history. Its target, Stalin's Soviet Union.
Hitler attacked along an 1,800-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In just 1 week, the Germans took 150,000 Russian prisoners. And within a month, Hitler's forces were within sight of Leningrad and the Soviet capital.
Now the ideology with which he had set out 20 years before had once again taken pride of place. Stalin had lost the mind game. Hitler had outwitted him. But Hitler would be the eventual loser. His decision to attack Russia signed the death warrant of his own dreams of empire and of European imperialism in general.
When you're trying to make a decision, never put yourself into the mind of the other person, because if you do, you can make a terrible mistake.
It was the heaviest, fastest, most merciless assault ever launched.
As the German army entered Riga on the 1st of July, they were greeted by delirious crowds. Other than being detested as invaders, the Germans were welcomed as liberators. Even Jews waved their red and white Latvian flags. Among them, the Latvian Jewish Vestamanis family. They would soon discover the Nazis' real intentions.
To get reliable supplies of oil, Japan would have to invade her neighbors to the south. The first objective was French Indochina. By agreement with the defeated government of France, Japan occupied the north of the colony. 10 months later, Japan swallowed the rest of Indochina. President Roosevelt's response was immediate. On the 26th of July, he banned all exports to Japan of oil. His move forced Japan into a corner. She could either fight her way out or capitulate.
In early August 1941, Churchill set sail for the New World. From the bridge of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, Churchill knew the next week might well decide the outcome of this war.
This trip over was really a moment of great excitement, probably some apprehension, but Churchill's enthusiasm at meeting Roosevelt was intense.
Sailing on the USS Augusta, Roosevelt traveled north through U-boat-infested waters towards his rendezvous point with Churchill at Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. On August 9, 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill finally met face to face. For 3 days, the leaders alternated meetings aboard the two warships.
He was very struck by Roosevelt's courage and fortitude. The fact that Roosevelt made such an effort, I mean an incredible physical effort to go from ship to ship and to even stand unaided on the quarterdeck at the meeting. It meant a lot to Churchill.
The conference produced the first joint declaration of the war. Churchill, so determined to ingratiate himself with his new ally, reluctantly signed what became known as the Atlantic Charter, a document that promised liberation for nations struggling under the yoke of Western colonialism. It was a direct attack on the British Empire. The Prime Minister reluctantly went along, rationalizing that without American help, there would be no empire to defend. On August 10th, Churchill choreographed a church service on the deck of the HMS Prince of Wales.
They sing, O God, our help in ages past, Eternal Father strong to save, and onward Christian soldiers. The lesson is from Joshua, which was the universe he would most want to protect from harm.
As FDR's ship sailed away, the Prime Minister turned to an aide and remarked that it had been a great hour to live.
Psychologically, I think it made people think in terms of us together. It was a very, very excellent PR move, especially on Churchill's part.
But to Churchill's dismay, the Americans still showed no signs of entering the war.
The central issue remained. Would Roosevelt get into the fight against Hitler soon enough to make a decisive difference?
In August 1941, German panzers drove deep into Russia, catching Stalin, their former ally, completely by surprise. The German army was soon well on the way to Leningrad. They were involved in the savage siege of Leningrad, and they then fought for the oil fields of Grozny as part of Hitler's push to Stalingrad.
It swept through the farms of the Ukraine and Belarus, heading for Kiev, Smolensk, Leningrad, Moscow, intending the utter extinction of the Soviet state and the Russian people. That was Hitler's plan. It was called the New Order.
So now this bloodthirsty gutter snipe must launch his mechanized armies upon new fields of slaughter. Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and to the Russian people.
The partisan movement was born. Stubborn, outraged, driven by love of country and home, the streams coalesced into a flood of resistance. Soon they were joined by soldiers of the Red Army.
On September 4th, an event out in the mid-Atlantic appeared to hand Roosevelt the pretext he needed. A German submarine fired on the USS Greer.
I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer without warning and with deliberate design to sink her.
In late summer 1941, Roosevelt turned to the military. He asked them to estimate how many men it would take to defeat Hitler and how long before U.S. forces could launch a counterstrike across the English Channel. The top-secret report, presented to Roosevelt at the beginning of December 1941, was codenamed Rainbow 5. To fight the war against Germany, Rainbow 5 called for the creation of a 5 million-strong expeditionary force. Those men would be ready to lead an invasion across the English Channel by the summer of 1943.
Within days of the Nazi attack on Russia, Lithuania and Latvia had been overrun, and the Germans were moving deliberately on Leningrad with over 1 million troops, 600 tanks, and 1,000 planes. Nazi panzer divisions smashed into ancient Pskov, crushing everything in their path. The German Army Group Nord was expected to conquer Leningrad in 4 weeks, by July 21st, 1941. On the ground were the 16th and the 18th Field Armies and the 4th Tank Group of the Wehrmacht. Hitler was determined to capture Leningrad quickly and then send the same forces to envelop Moscow. Hitler predicted, at the first blow, the Russian army will experience a defeat greater than the one suffered by the French army. Air attacks on Leningrad had begun September 6th, but the first intensive raid was September 8th. The Germans came that night in 2 main waves. The first wave at 6:55 p.m. dropped over 6,000 incendiary bombs. 10:35 p.m., a second wave of bombers dropped high explosive bombs of 500 to 1,000 pounds. Hitler declared, the war against Russia is a war of ideologies. The capture of Leningrad will deprive the Russians of the symbol of their revolution. Von Halder, chief of the German General Staff, von Halder concluded that the Russian campaign was won. The fascists broke through the defenses, cut across the railroads, and reached the shore of Lake Ladoga. Leningrad was besieged. In a final effort to save Leningrad, Stalin ordered Marshal Zhukov to the beleaguered city. The situation was almost hopeless. Zhukov reached out for more reserves. The sailors of the Baltic Fleet were called out to fight as infantry battalions. Zhukov pulled together a striking force of 50,000 men and launched his counterattack. He ordered, hold or die. By September the 26th, though the city remained surrounded, the German advance had been stopped. This was the first Russian success. In the meantime, Hitler ordered von Lieb's panzers to disengage from Leningrad and move south for the attack on Moscow. The siege guns stayed.
Germans had cracked Moscow's first defensive line and captured over 663,000 prisoners from a total of 3 million captured since the start of Barbarossa. Stalin had only about 90,000 men and 150 tanks left to defend Moscow itself. On the 13th of October, the 3rd Panzer Group was only 87 miles from Moscow. But the weather was bad, with heavy rain and snow. German tanks, with their narrow tracks, struggled to cope. Stalin organized 11 new armies that included 30 divisions of tough Siberian troops. In the south, the Soviets stopped the 2nd Panzer Group. On the 2nd of December 1941, a small number of light vehicles and motorcycle combinations reached the township of Khimki, close to the Moscow Ring Road. They were 14 miles from the Kremlin. Camouflage and plywood structures had been erected on Red Square to confuse the street layout from the German Luftwaffe, and on the 3rd of December, a Soviet force of local militia, supported by a few T-34 tanks, managed to push them out of Khimki. The German offensive against Moscow stalled.
The army minister, General Tojo, now took over the government.
General Hideki Tojo reads the imperial rescript issued in the name of the Emperor Hirohito. The rescript declares a state of war. It also calls on the Japanese people to shoulder the burden of sacrifice that will be necessary to secure the future of the Japanese Empire. It urges them to struggle for the fate of the Far East.
The deadline for negotiations was extended to the end of November.
On December 4th, 3 days before Pearl Harbor, The Chicago Tribune came out with gigantic headlines, Roosevelt's war plan. This was supposedly a plan that armed services all agreed with, and it was a huge uproar, this war plan. It was a fantastic gamble on Roosevelt's part.
A gamble because General Albert Wiedemeyer, the original architect of the plan, became convinced that the president was responsible for the leak. Wiedemeyer believed this was part of Roosevelt's clandestine campaign to get Germany to declare war on the United States first. 3 days later, Roosevelt would have his war, but not the one he expected or wanted to fight.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special broadcast. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from the air.
The attack shattered America's sense of invulnerability. 184 aircraft, launched from 6 Japanese carriers, caught the Pacific Fleet unaware. The USS California, West Virginia, and Arizona were sunk. 2,403 lives were lost. Roosevelt and his generals did suspect the Japanese might try something, but not an attack of this scale and not directed at the heart of America's Pacific Fleet. The attack transformed the American political landscape. Isolationism collapsed overnight.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us, we are now in this war. We're all in it, all the way. To overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
On the same day that the Japanese Navy strikes Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Army starts a series of concerted offensives against the Allied powers in Southeast Asia. On the mainland, elements of Lieutenant General Yamashita's 25th Army makes amphibious landings on the northern coast of Malaya. Reinforced with armor and extra artillery, the 3 Japanese divisions made good progress to the south. The American commander in the Philippines is General Douglas MacArthur, who has been made Field Marshal of the Filipino forces. The Japanese strike the Filipino and U.S. airfields on Luzon. They destroy over 100 aircraft, mostly on the ground. The Japanese start to land on Luzon during December the 10th, 1941. The city is soon bombed, dispiriting the civilian population and disrupting MacArthur's defenses. By now, the air base at Clark Field has been destroyed. December the 10th, when 2 British capital ships, the Prince of Wales and Repulse, are sunk by Japanese land-based warplanes. Already, the British position in Malaya is hopeless, since Singapore's defenses have been built facing the sea rather than landward.
But one of the immediate problems Roosevelt faced was that the carnage was in Pearl Harbor, and that didn't fit the Rainbow Five scenario. Winning the military over to this European strategy was made significantly easier for Roosevelt when Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States just 4 days after Pearl Harbor.
Churchill was in Washington within 3 weeks of Pearl Harbor. Germany had declared war on the United States, and the Allies had to plan grand strategy.
Acadia Conference began immediately. And over the next 3 weeks, the British and US Chiefs of Staff were to have 12 formal meetings, while the 2 leaders held their own private discussions.
Churchill impressed his own personality on his mother's native land.
I cannot help but reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own.
Oh, no. When Churchill came to the White House, everything was turned upside down. He tended not to go to bed till very late. He had a nap every afternoon, and FDR never had a nap, and then would sit up with Churchill late at night. And she saw the toll this was taking on FDR. But FDR enjoyed it. They didn't sit up doing policy. They were sitting up telling stories and exchanging things. But at the same time, woven in and out of the jokes were perceptions of how policy would proceed.
Roosevelt's generals wanted to invade Northern Europe, but Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to invade North Africa, where the British Army was already engaged. The Americans were dismayed.
Churchill soon discovered that American war planners were adamantly opposed to a Mediterranean campaign. They insisted that the right strategy was to open a second front in France as soon as possible. They wanted to land 9 Allied divisions on the Cherbourg Peninsula in 1942 to establish and hold a beachhead in France in preparation for a larger cross-channel operation in 1943.
We knew he was a canny, wily devil and manipulator. He was the first to admit that himself. We knew about his faults, but there was still something about him. He could pull out humor, pathos. He was a terrifically persuasive fellow.
It was a time for the military chiefs of both nations to establish procedures for jointly running the war. Never before or since have two nations worked so closely in time of war.
The Arcadia Conference, as it was codenamed, ended with considerable achievements, and ones which particularly pleased Winston. A formal command structure for the United Nations fighting the Axis powers was agreed, which gave the British, at least in theory, equal billing with the United States. The United States accepted that priority must be given to defeating Germany first. And the US High Command reluctantly accepted that the first move against German-occupied Europe would be a landing in North Africa.
As they quickly reveal in Hong Kong, the Japanese are highly capable, if brutal soldiers, and soon the British and American forces are in severe difficulty. British resistance is weak.
But it was also Christmas, and the British party took part in many of the White House festivities.
But was tired before it ended. On Tuesday, December the 30th, Winston went to the Canadian House of Commons to address the members. Here, he appeared to be very much at ease, and his entrance was greeted with great enthusiasm.
In 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. Some neck.
We left again for Washington by train on New Year's Eve, which carried us out of the old year of 1941 into the new 1942.
The Soviets launched a massive counterattack. By the 7th of January 1942, when the Soviet offensive halted, the Germans had been pushed back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. The battle for Moscow was over.
The Japanese take Manila on January the 7th, 1942.
We must raise our sights all along the production line. In this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes. Next year, 1943, we shall produce 125,000 airplanes, including 100,000 combat planes. Let no man say it cannot be done. It must be done, and we have undertaken to do it.
It would be the beginning of the largest military buildup in world history.
By the time Churchill prepared to fly home, he had considerable satisfaction, which was just as well, for the next few months were to be among the most worrying of the war. Churchill's most immediate danger, as he got back to London in January 1942, was from his own colleagues rather than the enemy.
Winston's homecoming was not without incident or embarrassment. For during his absence, a small group in the House of Commons, mostly of the left, had criticised his conduct of the war.
For the next 3 months were almost unrelievedly gloomy. Late in January, in the Western Desert, General Rommel, who had just been forced back over 300 miles into Libya, launched an unexpected counterattack, which recaptured much of the territory the Allies had gained. and brought him back to within striking distance of Egypt.
Millions of Americans were in training. The infantry, airborne infantry, field artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, armored cavalry, Army Air Corps pilots by the thousands. Tens of thousands of items rolled off the lines to supply not only ourselves, but our fighting allies.
In January 1942, American troops were stationed in Europe for the first time. By May 1942, 37,000 GIs were based in Northern Ireland.
A troopship crowded with men from the great cities and plains of North America, united now as allies of those United States.
But America's transition into war was neither easy nor without controversy. An order issued by FDR that forcibly uprooted more than 100,000 Japanese Americans and imprisoned them in distant internment camps.
On February the 8th, the Japanese crossed the Strait of Johor under cover of heavy air and artillery bombardment. They then advanced across the island towards the city of Singapore, taking many prisoners on the way. By February the 15th, General Percival concedes that all is lost. General Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, will not negotiate and demands immediate and unconditional surrender. The British have lost almost 139,000 British troops, most of them taken prisoner.
9 days later, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies.
Although Singapore's loss had shaken him, he said, "We must hold on. All will come right if we have patience." He faced the world with remarkable fortitude. Small annoyances and criticisms at this time made him difficult. But in time of real trouble, he is at his most human and most pleasant to all those who are around him.
On the 12th of March, General MacArthur, commander of the US forces on the Philippines, had to escape from the Bataan Peninsula by motor torpedo boat.
All resistance on Bataan ends on May the 6th.
The American commander in the Philippines, General Wainwright, bowed to the inevitable and surrendered the remainder of his forces. 80,000 Americans surrendered, the largest mass capitulation in American military history.
And on the 6th of May, the remaining troops on the island of Corregidor were also surrendered. A few days later, the Japanese completed the occupation of Burma after the longest retreat ever by a British army.
Arms and supplies from the United States and Great Britain came by convoy to this very spot in the harbor of Murmansk.
Using its Norwegian bases, the German Navy roamed through the barren straits, intent on closing Murmansk, Russia's only northern port that was ice-free year-round. The Germans sent in specialized troops, mountain infantry from Tyrol and Bavaria, supported by Finnish ski troops. The Wehrmacht's successes in Norway had been swift, and the troops were confident. Back in Germany, they enjoyed the newsreels showing how easy it all was, what fun the troops were having in the lands they conquered. Murmansk was only 40 miles away. Close Murmansk, and Russia would be cut off from Western aid. The mission of the Luftwaffe was to destroy the port city and to deny traffic in and out by sea. The first convoys left Britain in March 1942. Not all the ships made it to Murmansk. And the Nazi wolf packs all the way. It was north of the Norwegian coast when disaster hit. The British Admiral Tovey, in command, believing the German fleet was approaching, ordered the convoy to disperse. It was suicidal. The ships were loaded with tanks, food, shell presses, medical supplies, and thousands of tons of high explosives. The German bombers hunted down their scattered targets one by one. PQ-17 lost 24 of its 37 ships. The Soviets did what they could to help, shepherding the surviving vessels of PQ-17 into Murmansk. But Churchill, deeming the losses intolerable, suspended the convoys. They were not resumed until September 1942, when the days grew shorter.
The Allied position in the war against Japan now needs a bold stroke to boost Allied morale and dent Japanese confidence. In a tactically and technically daring move, 16 Mitchell twin-engine bombers are loaded on board the carrier USS Hornet. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle coordinates the plan with Captain Mark Mitchell of the Hornet. The Army bombers are to take off and bomb Tokyo, 800 miles distant. No destruction of vital targets can be achieved, but the raid will reveal to the Japanese that the USA is very far from being out of the war. The sight of the U.S. Army Air Force's twin-engine bombers clearing the forward end of the Hornet's flight deck and climbing away is, to say the least, remarkable. Halsey calls the mission one of the most courageous deeds in all military history.
It was at this low point that the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, came to London partly to sign a treaty of friendship with Britain, but mainly to get a commitment from Winston to launch an invasion of German-occupied Europe during 1942. Winston was determined not to do this until a sufficiently large Anglo-American force had been built up in Britain to undertake the extraordinarily difficult job of an amphibious assault on a heavily fortified coast. He pointed out that only 2 years earlier, when Britain was alone and had just suffered a massive defeat, Hitler had still been unable to undertake an invasion the other way. At the end of May, Rommel was on the move again in North Africa, aiming to outflank the British once more. The battle was still in progress as Winston set off for Washington yet again on the 17th of June.
By the summer of 1942, American industry was proliferating weapons of war, matching and even exceeding Roosevelt's ambitious challenge. Production plants were transforming the American workforce. The country had work for every able-bodied American.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor and go on to victory.
Now, Roosevelt had to assemble his military team.
The first example of which would be General Marshall.
By picking George Marshall to be the Army Chief of Staff, Roosevelt had reached well down the military's chain of command. But he found an officer with broad strategic vision and composure under fire.
I don't think that there was anybody that Roosevelt more relied upon for the national security interests of the United States during wartime than George Marshall. Yet he was the only one of Roosevelt's generals or admirals that he didn't call by his first name. It was always General Marshall.
General Marshall, working closely with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, began planning a global strategy to win the war. The president increasingly relied on Marshall, who served at his side at every Allied conference.
We had three options. Well, you could make your main effort against Europe, against Japan, or try to do both. And the first decision was we must defeat Germany first.
General Marshall was convinced in his mind that the war would never be over until the German war machine was destroyed.
But military considerations gave way to political pressures.
The path to victory in the Pacific was also coming into focus. At the helm, Roosevelt had appointed four-star General Douglas MacArthur as his theater commander.
Admiral Chester W. Nimitz leads the Navy-based forces operating over the vast Pacific Ocean areas from his headquarters in Hawaii.
In June 1942, Ike was named American commander of the European Theater of Operations.
Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Midway is to combine the superior firepower of his battleships with the air power of his carriers to decimate the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz prepares a strategy designed to give his outnumbered forces a tactical edge. For Midway, fought between June the 4th and 6th, the US Navy deploys the 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, with cruiser and destroyer escort under Admiral Fletcher. Ranged against them are Yamamoto's 4 fleet and 2 light carriers, 9 battleships, 11 cruisers, and 41 destroyers.
Of what these brave soldiers went through.
The US loses the fleet carrier Yorktown. The Japanese lose the fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These are all veterans of Pearl Harbor. They take to the bottom, with them the irreplaceable cream of the Japanese naval air arm. Midway cripples the Japanese Navy and gives the USA the strategic initiative it will keep in the Pacific for the rest of the war.
In 1942, the big picture was the possibility of a Russian capitulation. Stalin insisted that only the opening of a second front in northern France would save Russia from impending defeat. Also pressing the strategy were General George Marshall and many of the American chiefs. But Churchill strongly objected. He feared the casualties would be horrendous. For weeks, the Anglo-American allies spent their energies fighting each other.
There were knockdown, drag-out, bitter fights.
Equally, Churchill was worried that if he simply vetoed an early invasion of France, the Americans might decide to employ the troops against Japan instead, imperiling the whole Germany first strategy.
The coalition was in crisis before it had undertaken its first joint operation. On June 19, 1942, the British Prime Minister flew to Hyde Park to bridge the divide separating the two Allied nations. In the library of the Roosevelt family home, FDR and Churchill agreed to push ahead with the development of the Manhattan Project, the joint effort to build an atomic bomb. That agreement had been simple to achieve. But as the leaders sat around the pool at Eleanor's home at Valkill, Churchill tried to convince Roosevelt to commit U.S. troops to a North African landing. It wouldn't require taking on German forces directly. Instead, Churchill was promising an easier fight against the Vichy French.
But Churchill not only prevails upon Roosevelt to do this, but he manages, in one of the great act of political wizardry, to convince Roosevelt that the North African operation was Roosevelt's original idea, which was just nuts because it was really Churchill's operation. The American military chiefs of staff dismissed this as periphery pecking. Their objective was to knock out Germany's capacity to wage war by knocking out its industrial establishment. So North Africa, from this strategic perspective, was a great distraction.
The American general, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, wrote in his diary,
"Besides being a rank amateur in all military matters, FDR has been completely mesmerized by the British. The Limeys have his ear, and we have the hind tit."
He had reason to be despondent. Rommel in North Africa had driven British forces back after their earlier successes. For months, the British Empire fought alone as Hitler and his allies extended their tyranny.
It is upon this foundation that Hitler, with his tattered lackey Mussolini at his tail and Admiral Darlan frisking at his side, pretends to build out of hatred, appetite, and racial assertion a new order.
While on the Eastern Front, the limited offensive by the Red Army was brushed aside by the Germans as they prepared to launch their own summer assault on the oil fields of the Caucasus.
Rommel's army swept across North Africa, and the Nazis advanced on Stalingrad and the Russian oil fields.
Churchill's arts of persuasion were severely tested when he journeyed to Moscow to see Stalin with Averell Harriman, President Roosevelt's representative, to tell the Soviet leaders that there would be no second front in France in 1942. They had urgently demanded an invasion of Europe to take the pressure off the beleaguered Russians. Stalin was furious and accused Churchill of cowardice. Churchill responded emphatically.
He was annoyed and he lost his temper.
Churchill went straight from Moscow to North Africa to confer with his commanders. The British had been badly mauled by Rommel in the desert with heavy losses. It was time to reshuffle the generals and make a fresh start. He put General Montgomery in charge of the whole campaign. Then he turned to what he did best, boosting morale among the troops.
Turning point, not just at sea, but on land too. The island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons, the southernmost limit of the Japanese conquest. In August 1942,
led by General Alexander Vandergrift,
the Allies returned. For the Americans, it was their first invasion of the war.
It was our first offensive in the Pacific, and we went in with only one division.
But it was still as yet only a sideshow. The main energies were being reserved for Europe.
In Europe, Canadian commandos tested the German defenses in the ill-fated raid on the French Channel port of Dieppe. The landing ended in disaster for the valiant Canadians, but the lessons learned will save thousands of lives in landings to come.
Throughout the first half of 1942, shipping losses rose to crisis levels as the Allies struggled to build more escorts and provide more long-range aircraft to make up for the lack of intelligence about the whereabouts of the U-boat wolf packs.
PQ-18 was sent out, a total of 40 ships. The Luftwaffe found PQ-18 far from a friendly shore. Of the convoy's 40 ships, 13 sank in a running battle that exhausted the gun crews. Once more, Churchill suspended the convoy. In all, throughout the war, some 60 ships were lost. 811 warships and freighters made it. None did so easily.
In October, the British Eighth Army pushed across the desert and broke Rommel at El Alamein, opening up the whole North African coast. It was the first major British victory of the war, and the last they would win alone. It was the victory Churchill had waited for, and he exulted in the moment.
Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
A month after Alamein, American GIs finally enter ground combat in North Africa.
Operation Torch, the North African invasion, began on November 8, 1942. General George Patton, aboard the USS Augusta, oversaw the landing of more than 33,000 Allied forces. Roosevelt was in Hyde Park when he received news by telephone that the assault had begun. An aide noticed that his hand was trembling. He listened, then announced, "We have landed in North Africa. Casualties are below expectations. We are fighting back."
With the invasion a success, Rommel soon found himself squeezed between Eisenhower's forces to the west and the British to the east. The Germans had their backs to the wall.
After 27 years in the Army, Ike got his first combat assignment in November of 1942. Among the commanders sharing in the victory of Torch was Ike's old friend George Patton.
Ike realized that Patton was the most gifted tank commander.
The British and American forces had Rommel's Africa Corps surrounded.
I cannot tell you when or where the United Nations are going to strike next in Europe, but we are going to strike and strike hard.
Early in 1943, the Russians launched a massive counter. Retook Stalingrad, destroying a Nazi army of 330,000, capturing 17 of Hitler's generals.
Outside, the tide was turning. Stalingrad, the first great Soviet victory. An entire German army destroyed. As 1943 began, the Nazis reaped the whirlwind. Hitler had conquered other cities in days, other countries in weeks. Leningrad had defied him, invincible. Now she would reply. Some of Hitler's troops eventually did enter Leningrad, but not as conquerors.
In January 1943, FDR and Churchill arrived in newly liberated Morocco for a top-secret conference at Casablanca. Stalin was invited, but insisted it was too dangerous to leave Moscow.
Marshall renewed his call for an all-out invasion of Europe. He convinced Roosevelt that the time was right for an assault on France, the invasion of Normandy across the English Channel, codenamed Operation Overlord. But again, Churchill wanted to wait.
There were very many difficult negotiations with the British about then. Mr. Churchill wanted him to go into Greece, anything but face the cross-channel operation.
He particularly wanted to take the island of Rhodes, which the Germans then held. And after a long argument, Marshall, in considerable indignation, said, "I'll tell you this, no American boy is going to die on that goddamn island." And that ended the matter.
It was on the final day of the conference that FDR made real news. Without consulting Churchill, he announced uncompromising terms for ending the war against Hitler.
So then Roosevelt said, "I feel that victory against Germany, true victory against Germany, can only be achieved by unconditional surrender." And he looked at Churchill as if, of course, we agreed on this and so forth. And Churchill was absolutely flabbergasted. Standing behind Roosevelt was George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, and a whole slew of other American generals, all of whom loathed the idea, because it was only going to make the Germans fight harder.
But the purpose of Roosevelt's announcement was to stiffen Russian resolve, prove to Stalin that he should hang on, that America was serious about defeating Germany and intended to fight to the bitter end.
Up until 1940, Hitler looked younger than he was in reality. After that, however, he aged rather quickly. Up to 1943, he looked his age outwardly. Later, his rapid physical deterioration was obvious. Professor Dr. Hans Karl von Hasselbach, deputy attendant doctor to Adolf Hitler.
In April 1943, Rommel was recalled to Germany. After being driven from the port towns of Bizerte and Tunis, the Germans were pushed back to mainland Europe.
Address to the U.S. Congress, Washington, May the 19th, 1943. I am free to admit that in North Africa, we built better than we knew. The unexpected came to the aid of the design. For this, we have to thank the military intuition of Corporal Hitler. The same insensate obstinacy which condemned his army to destruction at Stalingrad has brought this new catastrophe upon our enemies in Tunisia.
Waldorf von Schirach came on June the 24th, Corpus Christi. He had a long and detailed conversation with Hitler, the contents of which I learned from Hitler the next evening. Schirach said unequivocally to Hitler that the war must be stopped somehow. Hitler said to him,
"What is he thinking? He knows as well as I that there's no way out now, unless I put a bullet through my head."
That was their last meeting. Niklaus von Below, Colonel, Luftwaffe Adjutant to Adolf Hitler.
Hitler badly needed a victory, but how, or what, or where? The generals implored him, showered him with plans, plotted for his attention. Tempers burst. Field Marshal von Kluge challenged General Guderian to a duel. At last, the finger pointed to this place, the Kursk salient, a great bulge of Russian troops in the middle of the German line. It began as an idea for an obvious and limited offensive battle and grew into a plan of enormous proportions, but it was only a plan. A nervous and now uncertain Hitler set a date in April and then canceled it. April passed into May, and May into June, and June into July, before he reluctantly let it happen. The biggest battle of World War II and the most massive tank battle the world would ever see was about to take place. It was no surprise to the Russians. They knew more about Hitler's plan than some of his own generals, the date, the place, the strength, the objective. 17 panzer divisions heaved mightily at the Russian line. A few hours later, the Russians heaved back. 20,000 Russian guns ripped the night into shreds of day. 1,000 banks of Katyusha rockets screamed at the Germans. The Germans were enticed into a deadly trap. The Russians left no detail to fortune. Blitzkrieg was the most ingenious and formidable tactic of war ever devised. The Russians found its fatal flaw. Each of its parts had a weakness. The Stukas, the guns, the tanks, the infantry. Each counted on the others to compensate for its weakness. Yet between these layers of firepower, separate them, and the Blitzkrieg could be broken. So the Russians, their guns stilled, their courage unbroken, waited for the tanks to run over them. Then they could get between the panzers and the infantry. Then they could destroy them. In all, 6,100 tanks fought each other on this enormous battlefield. Both sides lost heavily. The Germans lost irreparably. They would never be replaced.
On the same day our troops took Munda, Soviet forces smashed German defenses in central Russia.
Some Russians now thought they could defeat Germany single-handedly. 2/3 of the occupied territory had been recaptured. It seemed only a matter of pushing on into Germany until it was over. But Stalin knew that his whole country was war-weary. The effort had been colossal, almost superhuman. These people needed something to cheer them on, and an invasion in the West could do that.
The Allies went on to invade Sicily and Italy.
Probing what Churchill called the soft underbelly of the Axis, before trying to attack Hitler's hard snout in France.
During that day, 50,000 men and their equipment were landed. On Sicily's north coast, Patton's 7th captured Palermo and drove on eastward toward Messina. Mussolini had led his people through a nightmare of military disasters. His arrogant dictatorship had come to an end. Retributive justice was close at hand. The King of Italy ordered Marshal Pietro Badoglio to organize a new government and conduct secret negotiations for surrender.
General Mark Clark had led an invasion force into Italy at Salerno in September.
The sources of international brutality, wherever they exist, must be absolutely and finally broken. We are going to win the war, and we are going to win the peace that follows.
Under General Berling, the Kosciuszko Division received its baptism of fire in the late summer of 1943 at the village of Lenino on the road to Smolensk.
D-Day still hadn't happened, but the skies over German territory were filled with the bombs and bombers of the West, the British by night, the Americans by day. One of the prime targets, the long and dangerous run on the Plesty oil fields in Romania, Hitler's last source of natural petroleum.
In September 1943, the Red Army recaptured Smolensk from the Nazis, and with it the forests of Katyn. In January 1944, a Soviet committee assembled at Katyn to investigate the Polish tragedy, the massacre of 16,000 Polish officers.
On September the 8th, 1943, Adolf Hitler attends the briefing at Army Group South headquarters in Zaporozhye in the Ukraine to discuss the alarming situation in the Donbass region with its commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. In July, with German armoured divisions suffering major losses, the offensive against the protruding Soviet front at Kursk fails. In March, under Manstein's command, the Wehrmacht has been able to stabilise the Eastern Front after Stalingrad with a hard-fought victory in the so-called Third Battle of Kharkov, but subsequently had to vacate the city in August 1943. The retreat begins almost everywhere on the Eastern Front.
September the 10th, 1943. Special announcement. We have occupied Italy, encountered only little opposition. The army is being disarmed.
The war as a dangerous child's game. These young men, trying to overcome their boredom with alcohol, are just 17 years old. Their military title is Luftwaffenhelfer, or Air Force Helpers. From 1943 onwards, they replace regular soldiers sent to the front on the anti-aircraft guns in the homelands. At the end of 1943, there are 80,000 young flak helpers. As a rule, they are deployed near their hometown. High school students have 18 hours of school lessons a week at their posts.
Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler and the others were now troubled. They responded with new plots, double-cross, and more murder. The men who had to fight on in the name of Nazism knew the sides had changed in the soulless chill of a new Russian winter. Hitler ordered his men to stay and fight. As the fury of the Russian shock armies hit them, they fled, abandoning the sick and wounded. In a week, they found themselves not in Russia, but Estonia, heavy with a misery greater than anything they had known in this miserable war. In the Crimea, the Russians again trapped a whole German army. No retreat. Crimea was lost, and with it more than 100,000 troops.
On November 20th, 1943, the Allies' first major offensive strike against the Japanese in the Central Pacific was about to begin. The main target was Baishio, an island in the southwest corner of the Tarawa Atoll. Located in the middle of the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa contained a vital airstrip. The Allies wanted that airstrip whatever the cost. The Japanese commander had boasted, "1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." The U.S. admiral leading the pre-invasion bombardment made his own ill-fated quote, "We will not neutralize Baishio, we will not destroy it, we will obliterate it." Both men proved to be poor prophets. The Japanese had spent 20 months preparing for this battle by building an extensive network of defensive positions. Positions which by this point were expected to have been obliterated. 4,500 deeply entrenched elite Japanese troops kept the Allied invasion force pinned down, and the reinforcements were having trouble just making it to the landing zones. As night approached, the Marines held only 1/10 of a mile of beachhead. That 1/10 of a mile cost the Marines 1/3 of their initial invading force of 5,000 men. And the next day promised more of the same. There was no easy way to knock out the Japanese emplacements. The only answers? Grenades, TNT, and flamethrowers. Every strong point on the island would have to be taken in that manner. By the end of the second day, the Marines had succeeded in splitting the island's defenses in half. The Japanese literally fought to the last man. The Japanese even made their way through the water to demolished Allied landing craft when the Japanese strongholds were finally neutralized. The sacrifices of these young men were instrumental not only in capturing a vital air base in the Pacific, but also in teaching important lessons to the Allied military planners. This well-built Japanese bunker is one of the reasons that Tarawa took so many Marine lives. Only 17 of the 4,500 Japanese defenders survived the battle. By the end of Day 4, Allied planes were already using the captured airfield for reconnaissance and bombing missions. At Tarawa, acts of extreme heroism were commonplace. 4 Medals of Honor were earned, 3 posthumously. A war correspondent perhaps best summed up the victory with these few words: Tarawa was a triumph of the human spirit.
It was winter 1943. The stage was set for the Cairo-Tehran talks. Roosevelt and Churchill met with Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo. Even at the moment fighting was most intense in Italy, high-level master plans continued to be made for the invasion of France and for other Allied operations throughout the world. At Cairo, talks centered on the relation of European operations to the war in the Pacific.
By the fall of '43, FDR would finally meet the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Churchill warned the president that the Bolsheviks weren't to be trusted. Roosevelt thought he knew better.
Drawing communist Russia into peacetime, moving beyond the era of European imperialism, and above all, persuading Americans to take up the burdens of international leadership in an improved version of Wilson's League of Nations. Roosevelt didn't simply want victory. He wanted to shape an enduring worldwide peace and avoid a repeat of the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson. It was in search of those goals that Roosevelt traveled halfway around the world in November 1943 for summit meetings in Tehran.
On the afternoon of November 11th, 1943, Roosevelt stole away from the White House, crossing the Atlantic, for a top-secret conference in Tehran with Winston Churchill, and, for the first time, the person FDR most wanted to meet, Joseph Stalin.
Roosevelt genuinely believed, I think, that it was possible to bring the Reds in from the cold into the family of nations, and that he was the man to do it.
Before the first session, Roosevelt warned Churchill that he intended to poke fun at the British Prime Minister's bulldog determination.
Really, what he was to do was to ingratiate himself with Stalin at Churchill's expense.
Despite the advanced warning, the ridicule proved difficult to accept for the notoriously insecure Prime Minister.
I think he was humiliated by it. I think he was angry but stoical. Again, it was this question which was always in Churchill's mind. Have I established a real intimacy with Roosevelt? Am I going to be able to be absolutely honest with him?
Roosevelt concluded from their conversations that Stalin was fundamentally a practical man he could do business with.
Whether Roosevelt felt the strategy worked remains unclear. However, Tehran did produce tangible, if controversial, agreements.
Stalin, it seems to me, quite understandably came away from that meeting thinking that he had approval for Franklin Roosevelt for being the dominant power in Eastern Europe.
A tacit understanding given, in part, to win Soviet agreement to take on Japan after the fall of Germany. FDR returned to Washington claiming he had secured a breakthrough at Tehran, that he'd established a close personal relationship with the Soviet leader. He gave an upbeat assessment for the weekly newsreels.
I may say that I got along fine with Marshal Stalin.
He is a man who combines a tremendous, relentless determination with a stalwart good humor. And I believe that we are going to get along very well with him and the Russian people. Very well indeed.
Privately, Roosevelt later told Eleanor that the greatest challenge he faced was to win Stalin's trust.
It was time to name the supreme commander for the Allied invasion of France.
Roosevelt, en route home from Tehran, stopped off at Tunis to see General Eisenhower and to tell him that he was to command Overlord. The grand design for victory in Europe was now completed.
Roosevelt told his family why.
He has the best political mind of all the generals I have.
Just 3 years earlier, he was an obscure colonel. But from D-Day forward, he would be among the most famous men on Earth. The eyes of the world were on Ike to stay.
New Year's Proclamation, 1944. The year 1944 will make hard and heavy demands on all Germans. The monstrous events of the war will come closer to crisis this year. We are fully confident that we will endure. Adolf Hitler.
As 1944 began, Roosevelt was about to face the rigors of yet another presidential campaign. By now, his body was wearing down. His energy and drive were waning. His closest friends feared he might not live to relish the fruits of a battle won. On the Soviet front, Russian troops defeated the Nazis at Leningrad and Stalingrad. Hitler's troops were now in headlong retreat as Soviet divisions moved toward the Polish eastern border.
Leningrad had survived an ordeal that had started 6 months before Pearl Harbor and extended until 6 months before the Normandy invasion. The 900-day siege of Leningrad, the longest ever endured by a modern city, had come to an end.
The Red Army was driving the Germans out of the Ukraine.
There was the battle for Monte Cassino.
The previous night, 1,077 English planes had dropped 3,715 tons of bombs on Berlin.
During the big build-up, England had become a vast staging area for troops and the materiel of war. Thousands of vehicles and ready-to-be assembled combat-type aircraft. 20,000 railroad cars and 1,000 locomotives. 20 million square feet of covered storage and shop space. 44 million square feet of open storage space to hold the growing volume of supplies, wire, tires, bombs, shells, and other explosive devices. Awaiting invasion port embarkation were thousands of trucks and support vehicles, row upon row of tanks, wide range of artillery weapons, 170 miles of new railroad had been constructed to haul more than 2 million tons of supplies and combat hardware to the invasion ports. The United States Army had constructed 163 airfields in England for the Allied planes that were systematically bombing Germany day and night. Involved in this massive amphibious invasion were some 3 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen. 4,000 ships and boats. 20,000 vehicles of all types, and an endless list of combat support weapons.
The invasion of France, all were poised to crack the Nazi chokehold on Europe.
The invasion directive issued by the combined chiefs of staff was concise. General Eisenhower had his orders.
On the afternoon of the 4th of June, the weather reports for the next day were so bad that Eisenhower decided that the invasion must be postponed. But the meteorologists were confident that a break in the storms was coming, so Eisenhower made the critical decision to delay the landings only by 24 hours, until the 6th. Many of the troops were already at sea and had to endure an appalling wait.
While our assault forces prepared for H-hour, Allied naval power began their concentrated shore bombardment.
The 6th of June, 1944.
A pre-dawn naval bombardment prepares the way for Allied soldiers to assault the Normandy beaches.
The command of Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Hitler was told of the landing on the morning of June the 6th. He expressed relief when he received the first report and said now it would be possible to beat the enemy.
FDR and Churchill ordered more than 150,000 men into action, deployed across the English Channel on 5,000 ships, the largest armada in history.
The general feeling was, okay, if this is it, let's get in there and get it over with.
They gave us the final briefing then. We knew what to do and how. They told us where and when. I listened to every word. Else was wondering the same thing.
Now, from the White House, the president led the nation in prayer.
Our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization. Help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee, in this hour of great sacrifice.
Over 40,000 airborne troops were dropped, and the bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven were taken.
By midday, the Americans were beginning to cut a foothold on the coast. The second assault wave was already landing on the other 4 Allied beaches. Allied casualties were much lower than expected, 10,000 dead and wounded. The battle for the beaches was over in a matter of hours. Operation Overlord, the struggle for the liberation of Europe, was just beginning.
The previous night, FDR told his family that he wanted to retire from public life, but felt that wasn't an option until final victory was secured. That required election to an unprecedented 4th term.
Throughout 1944, the United States forces swept on through to Japan. They had crushed the Japanese at Midway and pushed them out of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. After seizing the Marshall Islands, the Allies began looking for a way to soften up the Japanese mainland with heavy bombers in preparation for the invasion of Japan. Step 1 was the invasion of the island of Saipan, the most heavily defended in the Marianas Group. A massive U.S. naval presence was stationed offshore to attack the Japanese Navy should it attempt to move into the area. Here, U.S. planes take to the sky in preparation for the Japanese carriers that were on their way to stop the Americans from taking Saipan. Most of Japan's experienced airmen had been killed by 1944. Many Japanese pilots in this action had only a few months of training before being rushed into combat. To add to their disadvantage, the most common Japanese plane, the Mitsubishi Zero, had become outdated. In earlier dogfights, its speed and maneuverability had made it a great success, but America now had faster, better armored aircraft. Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot, giving the battle its legendary name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Dozens of Japanese planes were destroyed in a matter of minutes. By the end of the day, 300 Japanese pilots had been shot down, while just 29 American planes had been lost during the battle. The most one-sided dogfight in history had resulted in the utter defeat of Japan's air power in the Pacific. After the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese were never again able to launch a major aerial offensive in World War II. But the battle for Saipan was only half over. Carrier planes now turn their attention to the island itself, and once again, you are there. On June 16th, the invasion of Saipan was launched as 20,000 American troops went ashore. 20,000 more soldiers would follow in the next few days, enough manpower to overwhelm the Japanese defenders. The U.S. forces encountered a new Japanese philosophy in the battle for Saipan. Instead of an offensive strategy of wasteful banzai charges, the Japanese stayed back, dug in, and took every Allied life they could before their own lives were taken. Every inch of Saipan was paid for in blood, as the U.S. troops had to dislodge the deeply dug-in Japanese defenders. The caves and bunkers that made up the defensive lines had to be taken one by one with grenades and flamethrowers. It wasn't until July 9, 1944, that the island was finally declared secure. It had taken 23 blood-drenched days to finally dislodge the 26,000 Japanese defenders. With possession of Saipan's airstrips, the bombing of the Japanese homeland 1,300 miles away was now possible. The Allies were closing in on Japan, one hard-fought island at a time.
The GIs didn't get much farther than the hedgerows of Normandy, pinned down by fierce German resistance. Meanwhile, another D-Day dawned on the Eastern Front. On the 21st of June, the Red Army unleashed its summer offensive into Byelorussia. In 5 weeks, while Eisenhower and Montgomery were bogged down in Normandy, the Red Army destroyed 20 German divisions and drove forward 450 miles to the gates of Warsaw.
Their control of the air was so total that German counterattacks and reinforcements to the battle area were being severely disrupted.
By 1944, he was in a race against his own mortality. The country had been told nothing about Roosevelt's medical condition.
Montgomery had launched Operation Goodwood to capture Caen and hold the bulk of German armor to the east, 3 days before Winston landed.
A bomb exploded. Nothing happened to the boss, but the hut was blown sky high.
Heinz Linge, valet to Adolf Hitler. With a calm smile, he said,
Linge, someone tried to kill me.
I heard about the attack from Professor Morell on the platform in Görlitz. His pulse was completely calm and as normal as any day. On the outside, you couldn't see anything. When the train with Mussolini arrived, I saw Hitler extend his left hand to his guest. Paul Otto Schmidt, interpreter for Adolf Hitler.
The radio broadcast details of the attack. The bomb was planted by a Count von Stauffenberg. Around 1 o'clock, the Führer spoke to prove that he had survived. What would have happened if the Führer had died? The war would be over, and there would be revolution in Germany.
His confidence, his faith in victory and his assurance, but also his power consciousness and delusions of grandeur now exceeded all boundaries of reason.
When Herr Hitler escaped his bomb on July the 20th, he described his survival as providential. We can all agree with him, for certainly it would be most unfortunate if the Allies were to be deprived in the closing phases of the struggle of that form of warlike genius by which Corporal Hitler has so notably contributed to our victory. Winston Churchill, address to the House of Commons.
Rommel was replaced in France by Field Marshal von Kluge, a tough veteran of the Eastern Front. The same orders were intercepted and read by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. The Allies were waiting.
When Winston reached Monty's headquarters the next day, the Western Allies were on the brink of a military triumph, and the British were locked in combat with the German 5th Panzer Army. A week later, a new U.S. Army, the 3rd, under America's most flamboyant general, George S. Patton, blitzkrieged through this, cutting deep behind the German forces defending Normandy. Winston was desperate to get back to the action.
I have already indicated to you why I accept the nomination which you have offered me, in spite of my desire to retire to the quiet of private life. You in this convention are aware of what I have sought to gain for the nation, and you have asked me to continue.
On the evening of July 21st, 1944, his name was placed in nomination for a 4th term at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Present to this convention for the office of President of these United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
In the end, to avoid a floor fight, Missouri Senator Harry Truman became the compromise candidate for the vice presidency. FDR continued his journey to Pearl Harbor. There, he met military leaders to discuss the Pacific war strategy. For over a year, MacArthur had protested the European first strategy. He warned that nothing short of an invasion of Japan would secure total victory, an invasion that might cost 1 million American lives. Roosevelt saw a partial solution. He would get the Soviets to end their policy of Asian neutrality and join the fight. The trip ended with a tour of a local hospital, and with the press kept away, he made a remarkably intimate disclosure.
You could see him fading almost daily. You could see him going downhill. So he was actually a little guy in a big suit at the end. He had gotten down to where he was not physically able to do the job.
But he was determined to summon the strength needed to withstand the rigors of one final campaign. The campaign was a testament to Roosevelt's courage and the public's willingness to be deceived.
This is Judy Garland with a suggestion for tomorrow. Here's the way to win the war. Win the war, win the war. Here's the way to win the war. You gotta get out and vote.
The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, visited Montgomery in the field on the day after Operation Goodwood ended. And while the two men were together, news reached them of an extraordinary event in the East that offered hope of a total German collapse.
In 14 days, a powerful storm tide swept over the German front lines, burying everything in its path and surging 800 kilometers forwards.
5 days after the attempt on Hitler's life, the Americans launched Operation Cobra. It was the great push in the West. 3,000 aircraft were to lay a carpet of high explosives in a corridor just 5 miles wide. The full weight of the American blow fell on a line defended by barely 50 tanks, 1,700 men. It was the final act in the unforgiving battle of attrition that had swept through the wheat fields and hedgerows of Normandy. The battle had been won by the overwhelming weight of Allied war materials, artillery and armour, above all, Allied aircraft.
The German army was disintegrating. We were quite clear that we'd won the tournament. It was just going to be a question of time.
By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had completed its plans for liberating Poland. Marshal Zhukov represented the Soviet High Command. Marshal Rokossovsky commanded the actions of the First Belarusian Front. Helm had suffered under the German occupation for 5 years. It was the first town to be liberated. With Helm secured, Rokossovsky drove an armored spearhead towards Lublin, the first big Polish city on the road to Warsaw. The home of the Polish Committee of National Liberation. As soon as Lublin had been purged of Nazis, the Committee of Liberation set up a provisional government. The London Poles and the Lublin Committee had deep differences on the structure of Poland's future.
The war is well in hand in a vast area, either in Europe or in the Far East, or the war against Japan itself.
Finally, Paris was in sight on August 25th, 1944. But for the Allies, there were still many miles between Paris and Berlin.
Paris is liberated, and French troops lead the way after 4 years of Nazi occupation.
4 long years of occupation were over. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was advancing north toward the Reich.
Allied armies held bridgeheads all along the line of the Seine and Marseille. the British and Canadians took Brussels and the great port of Antwerp.
The people of Brussels laughed and cried and threw flowers in the tank and said, "Goodbye, Tommy," when they meant to say hello. Man, they were happy.
There had been wild rejoicing when on September the 4th British tanks had seized the Belgian city of Antwerp. The speed of the Allied advance presented Eisenhower with rival plans for the conquest of Germany. One British-led, the other American.
September 1944, the Red Army broke through into Romania and Bulgaria.
Until the end, he had a firm grip on everything. If he had lost his composure just once,
Number 1 Staveley Road was the first house in London to be destroyed by Hitler's vengeance weapon. But this represented an entirely new degree of danger.
On the Western Front, Allied armies broke through the Franco-German border and pushed up through Italy toward the Alps.
At this time, he was meeting Churchill at a conference in Quebec. Both men had lost interest in the Warsaw Rising.
Field Marshal Montgomery was engaged in a very different battle. Monty pressed his plan for a daring thrust across occupied Holland to the River Rhine. Operation Market Garden. In the early hours of September the 17th, the first of more than 30,000 Allied soldiers began to board aircraft for the largest airborne operation ever launched. The bridges were to be seized before the Germans could destroy them, but at Arnhem, they were up to 8 miles from the drop zones. 2 hours march. It had taken German commanders just hours to reorganize. By day 3, attempts to reinforce the paras at the northern end of the bridge had been abandoned. A small force of British paras was able to secure the northern end of the Arnhem Road Bridge, but by September the 19th, the morning of day 3, they were well behind schedule. The British had made contact with the American 101st Airborne Division at Eindhoven on the 18th. But beyond it, the Germans had blown the bridge over the canal at Somme. The following morning, they were across. It wasn't until the 5th day of the battle that the last of the reinforcements were dropped at Arnhem. The Germans were waiting. The vanguard of 30 Corps had crossed the last great bridge at Nijmegen on the evening of the 4th day, and then stopped, exhausted. But by the time the tanks had begun to roll again, the paras clinging to the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge had been overwhelmed. The remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were pinned into a shrinking pocket to the west of the village of Oosterbeek. The battle for Arnhem was lost. The British advance had reached the opposite bank of the Rhine, but would go no further.
The horror had been so great that it would be a long time before they could even show emotion. The first 6 weeks of the fighting in Poland cost the Red Army 250,000 killed and wounded. Now, in the summer of 1944, Warsaw was to undergo the worst of all its sufferings. They had little water, no food, no medical supplies. They were receiving nothing from the outside. It took 2 months, but at last the citizens of Warsaw were overwhelmed. 300,000 Poles had died in the uprising. On October 2nd, the Home Army surrendered.
October the 7th, 1944, morning briefing. Beginning of the attack on East Prussia and Budapest. Long discussion with Goering. Station 12 heavy anti-aircraft batteries immediately to protect the Fuhrer's headquarters.
On October 11th, Hitler ordered, raise Warsaw to the ground. And that they did, with great efficiency.
On October the 12th, 1944, Hitler took me aside and explained that he would pull all available forces together and launch a major offensive in the West.
That will be the big strike which must succeed.
But the tide of the war was turning against Germany. By the autumn of 1944, the Red Army was retaking the ground it had lost to the Germans. Now in retreat, the noose was tightening around the Nazis' necks.
And in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, the Soviet armies were advancing relentlessly as the Nazi puppet governments crumbled.
On the 13th of October 1944, the Soviet army recaptured Riga.
And Churchill saw the best way to preserve British influence in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean was to do a deal with Stalin. In October 1944, he went to Moscow to do just that. Stalin was on his best behavior. Among his other murderous talents, he'd always had the ability to charm. Avril Harriman reported back to Roosevelt.
Stalin was in high mood yesterday. He paid Churchill an unusual and significant compliment by attending the ballet at the Opera House.
I have had very nice talks with the old bear. I like him the more I see him. Now they respect us here, and I'm sure they wish to work with us. I have to keep the President in constant touch, and this is the delicate side.
At one of his tete-a-tetes with Stalin, Churchill secretly produced what he later called his naughty document, carving up Eastern Europe into British and Russian spheres of influence. In Romania and Bulgaria, the Russians would have 90% influence, in Greece the British 90%, Yugoslavia and Hungary 50-50. Churchill guiltily told Stalin,
It is better to express these things in diplomatic terms and not to use the phrase dividing into spheres, because the Americans might be shocked.
But though the naughty document remained secret, Roosevelt was informed of the broad thrust of the deal, and he was not shocked. What mattered to him was that Churchill was now trying to seek compromise with Stalin rather than confrontation.
At the beginning of November 1944, the American army dominated the war in Western Europe.
At the end of 1944, Germany was still able to defend itself and put up serious resistance.
In Berlin, Hitler and the Nazi leadership were planning the final defense of Germany. In the West, the Allies were poised to cross the Rhine. On December the 16th, 1944, a German storm burst along 50 miles of the Allied front. Hitler had ordered his armies to strike through the Ardennes forests to the River Meuse, and then onto the port of Antwerp. If successful, it would split the Allied front.
Because of the rapid initial progress made by the heavy assault against our weakly held line, with the resulting penetration into our front that reached a maximum depth of some 50 miles.
The small market town of Bastogne stood before the German advance. On the morning of December the 19th, the 101st Airborne Division began to take up positions around the town. The airborne troops had made it just in time. Bastogne was under siege. The Germans had driven a wedge more than 30 miles deep.
Its military still consisted of around 17.5 million men, of whom 5.3 million were fighting troops.
Ike recognized the opportunity of the attack. He looked to George Patton.
Eisenhower turned to Patton and said, "George, what can you do?" Patton replied, "I can attack in 48 hours.
December the 19th, 1944. The weather was so bad that I directed all Army chaplains to pray for dry weather. I also published a prayer and sent it to all members of the command. George S. Patton, Jr., Commander of the 3rd U.S. Army.
Mighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee
of thy great goodness, to restrain this immoderate weather, grant us fair weather for battle.
Adolf Hitler, at the end of December 1944, to his adjutant Nicolas von Below. I know the war is lost. Their superiority is too great. I would prefer to put a bullet in my head now. We will never capitulate, never. We can perish, but we'll take the world with us.
Sunday, January the 13th, 1945. Frau Gassner said today that the Russians were coming.
In 1945, the Soviet armies forced the Nazis from Polish soil. It was a long war for the Poles, longer than for anyone else on the continent of Europe. Poles were still dying in Wrocław, when in Berlin the fighting had ceased in May of 1945. The liberation of Poland cost the Red Army 600,000 lives. The German occupation and the fight against the Nazis cost the Poles 6 million. The concentration camps in Poland were some of the very worst.
There was a railway line that ran directly to the Auschwitz and Sobibor death camps in Poland. In just 1 month, 11,000 were taken to the death camps.
When the Red Army and the Polish divisions finally reached Warsaw in January of 1945, 9/10 of the city no longer existed. Warsaw had been the goal of Polish fighting men everywhere, for the tank crews fighting on the Second Front. Late in November, the Soviet High Command approved plans for the Red Army's winter offensive, ranging from the Vistula to the Oder, and encompassing the liberation of the rest of Poland. January 12, 1945, the opening of the offensive that would carry the Red Army to the gates of Berlin. Marshal Zhukov commanded the 1st Belarusian Front, and Marshal Konev the 1st Ukrainian Front. Between them, they mustered 2 million soldiers, 32,000 guns and mortars, 6,500 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft. A clear superiority over the Nazi forces opposing them. They ripped through the main line of the German defenses the first day. Within a week, Warsaw was encircled. It was unlike any other city the Red Army had liberated. There were no people at all to greet them. Gradually, spirits began to rise, and essential services were restored.
It was one of the shortest inaugural addresses ever given, just 573 words.
In the days and the years that come, we shall work for a just and honorable peace, a durable peace, as today we work and fight for total victory in war.
By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Patton had come to the rescue.
Hitler had staked a huge amount on the Ardennes offensive, but his gamble had failed. 80,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded or captured, and more than 100,000 Germans were casualties of the fighting. The Battle of the Bulge marked the disastrous end to 4 months of failure.
Adolf Hitler, last radio address to the German people, January the 30th, 1945. Thus I now appeal to the entire German people to gird themselves with a yet greater, stronger spirit of resistance until we can again, as before, put on the graves of the dead of this titanic struggle a wreath inscribed with the words, "And yet you were victorious."
Big day. Our Führer has spoken. The Russians are coming. But we will be victorious again and beat back the Bolsheviks.
On February the 3rd, Roosevelt landed at Saki Airport in the Crimea. Churchill had already arrived and was in the welcoming party. From Saki Airport, it was a 7-hour drive to Yalta. The opening dinner gave little encouragement of Roosevelt's appetite for the task ahead. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, was among the guests.
February 4th, 1945. Dinner with Americans. The President vague and loose and ineffective. Winston, understanding that business was flagging, made desperate efforts and 2 long speeches to get things going again. Stalin's attitude to small countries struck me as grim, not to say sinister.
Everyone was shocked by his appearance.
Roosevelt had 2 key objectives at Yalta. The first and most immediate was to secure Russian entry into the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. Roosevelt succeeded by secretly bribing Stalin with offers of Japanese and Chinese territory. The second, and most important, was to agree with Stalin the structure of a post-war United Nations organization, headed by a Security Council.
I have never known the Russians so easy and accommodating. In particular, Joe has been extremely good. He is a great man, and shows up very impressively against the background of the other 2 aging statesmen. I think the conference has been quite successful. We've got an agreement on Poland which may heal differences for some time at least, and assure some degree of independence to the Poles.
Roosevelt told Eleanor that he felt he had no choice but to trust the Soviet leader.
Hopeful that Stalin would come to understand that the United States was not an aggressive imperial power, that we had no long-term designs on destroying the Soviet system or Soviet government.
In 1945, American forces were fighting their way towards Tokyo to invade mainland Japan. The Japanese knew it and presumed the U.S. would need to capture a tiny volcanic island called Iwo Jima on their inevitable path to the homeland.
Capture of Iwo Jima was expected to take 10 days. It took 36. It was the bloodiest assault in the history of the U.S. Marines.
While the Japanese had no hope of holding the island, they had time to heavily fortify it. Their goal? Inflict as much damage as possible while holding off a U.S. invasion of mainland Japan. It was a hell called Iwo Jima. 36 days that would define the Japanese men sent to defend this rock, as well as the young Americans who would conquer it.
Iwo Jima was about getting the airfields. The Japanese had built 2 great airfields on it. They had a lot of Zeros stationed there, and the Zeros could attack our B-29s headed to mainland Japan.
The kamikaze attacks at Iwo Jima inflicted more than 300 casualties to the sailors supporting the Marines on shore.
To prepare for the invasion, American air forces pounded Iwo Jima in the longest sustained aerial offensive of the war, 72 days. And to create a blockade, the largest armada that had ever been assembled in the Pacific surrounded the island's 22,000 Japanese defenders. The U.S. fleet carried nearly 70,000 men to guarantee the capture of Iwo Jima. It was considered that critical.
The beach that we're going to land on now looks to be very hot from here.
that American tanks could barely get a grip on the stuff to move inland. One exasperated pride, it's like digging a hole in a barrel of wheat.
The first wave of Americans to hit the beach faced little enemy fire. But this was by design. The Japanese strategy was to get as many Marines as possible onto land, where they could be shot in concentration. It was a deadly plan that would put thousands of Marines directly in their enemy's crosshairs.
Medics put their own lives in danger to help their wounded comrades.
The defenses that would prove so lethal to the Americans. To the south, a natural defense point of the island was Mount Suribachi. On the 5th day of combat, a 40-man patrol was given a daunting order: plant an American flag atop Iwo Jima. February 23, 1945. A single photograph captured the most famous and reproduced image of World War II, and perhaps of all time.
To clear out the northern end of the island, Marines had to traverse rocky terrain embedded with Japanese snipers and mortars. The only way to attack the entrenched Japanese positions was from up close. As the Marines cautiously climbed the flanks of Suribachi, they could actually hear the Japanese talking inside the volcano. For the next 4 days, those Japanese voices would be systematically silenced by flamethrowers and hand grenades.
We could see the Cologne Cathedral a long time before we got there. That tower was our objective. It was on the Rhine River.
Our Air Force is giving the old lumps on the east bank of the Rhine, but we're still nervous.
Was the first decent-sized town we had taken, but there wasn't any celebration because we knew nothing had been settled. One of the men said, "God, are we going to have to go right across the world doing this to beat them?" Because most of Caen was dust, just plain dust. But of the city, we knew there was a big do coming up.
The American 9th Army under Simpson reached the Elbe River. They were now only 50 miles from the capital.
After 16 lethal days of combat, the airfields were finally secure enough to allow American P-51 pilot Jerry Yellen and his fellow aviators to land on Iwo Jima.
And it turned out to have tremendous strategic value in more ways than one.
While the battle for Iwo Jima did not end the war in the Pacific, it hastened Japan's ultimate surrender. And with the capture of Iwo Jima's 2 airfields, American planes could safely take off and return from bombing raids over Japan. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 called the Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying the first atomic bomb. She was joined by 2 escort planes before heading to the target of Hiroshima. Their rendezvous point? Iwo Jima. 4 out of every 5 men who fought on this island would either be killed or wounded. 28,000 died protecting or seizing this piece of volcanic rock.
The Nazi garrison of Poznan totaled 60,000, 3 times what the Soviets had expected. It took days for General Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, the veterans of Stalingrad, to subdue it. The Nazis raised the white flag of surrender, and the Polish flag surmounted it. the time Poznan was back in Polish hands, the Soviet grand offensive had rolled closer to the Oder and the heart of Germany. Some of the Soviet armor was now advancing more than 40 miles a day. To the north, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front was moving along the Baltic shore. Its objective, Gdansk. One by one, the seaports fell to Rokossovsky's infantry. Ahead lay the last river, the Oder.
From their forward bases in the Mariana Island, American B-29 bombers were already attacking Japan's cities with more conventional weapons. On March the 9th, 1945, 2,000 tons of incendiaries were dropped on Tokyo. More that night in Tokyo than in the whole of England in the Blitz. By the spring of 1945, Japan was helpless in the face of American air and naval power.
During the last 4.5 months of the war, 471,000 tons of bombs are dropped on Germany, twice as much as in the whole of 1943. In March 1945 alone, 3 times as many bombs fall as in all of 1942.
Herr Hermann says that we have a new rocket that flies even as far as to the Anglo-Americans. I certainly hope so.
This took place on March the 20th, 1945. Arthur Axmann, leader of the Hitler Youth.
In mid-March 1945, Hitler transfers nearly all of his activities to the bunker under the Chancellery.
Adolf Hitler had begun to limit his public appearances as the war progressed and Germany began to lose. His last proper public speech was made on the 23rd of March 1943, the Zeughaus, Berlin's old armory building, on Heroes' Memorial Day.
On the 23rd of March, Field Marshal Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, his long-awaited blitz-like offensive on the Rhine, near Wesel.
There was this tremendous barrage that went on, the barrage from all the 2nd British Army.
Following the nighttime crossing, paratroopers were dropped on the east bank of the Rhine, right on the German defence line. On March the 27th, both British 2nd and US 9th Armies had crossed the Rhine under the operational command of Montgomery. The Americans had a major bridgehead at Remagen, while General Patton had another between Mainz and Oppenheim. Berlin, the prize, was now clearly in the Allies' sights.
Winston was impatient with the cautious, broad front advance favoured by the American High Command. He wanted to push on faster to take Berlin and Prague ahead of the Russians.
With the Western Allies across the Rhine, Monte, in charge of 3 armies, assumed that he would be the one pressing on to Berlin.
On March the 30th, the Allied Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, sent a signal to Stalin, saying that he was concentrating his forces on southern Germany. Stalin instantly summoned his 2 marshals, Zhukov and Konyev, and demanded of them,
"Who is going to take Berlin? Are we or the Allies?"
Zhukov and Konyev began a race to Berlin.
April the 1st, American troops land on Japanese soil, Okinawa. They face fierce resistance.
April 12th, 1945. FDR awoke, seemingly refreshed. Elizabeth Shumatov, a Russian artist, arrived to work on a portrait of Roosevelt. At noon, Madame Shumatov remarked that he seemed so much better today. Roosevelt replied that he was getting tired and needed a break. The next day, FDR's body left Warm Springs for the final time. There would be no state funeral for Franklin Roosevelt. He had insisted it would be inappropriate with American boys dying on battlefields in distant lands. Instead, the caisson was borne slowly through the streets of the nation's capital to the White House, a time for Americans to reflect on what they had lost. The reaction to his death went beyond the loss of a wartime leader. It reached back to earlier times, to a personal connection established between this president and the American people, an appreciation of the distance they had traveled together. One mourner told a journalist, "I never knew Roosevelt, but he knew me." His final resting place was at the very center of his universe, in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park. Escorting Eleanor was the new president, Harry Truman. Never a Roosevelt confidant, Truman weighed a personal ambivalence against political achievement.
The Soviets were gathered at the Oder. They were only 40 miles away from Hitler's capital.
The Red Army made rapid progress into Germany and reached Berlin on the 20th of April, 1945.
It was obvious that the defense forces in Berlin were far too weak. They were a group that had simply been thrown together. The westerly suburbs towards Spandau were only defended by the Hitler Youth. Boys of 15, 16 or younger, just children.
The Third Reich's days were over.
We are not entirely guiltless, we the Allies, because it took us 12 years to open the gates of Dachau. We were blind and unbelieving and slow, and that we can never be again.
On April the 21st, I went directly to the map room for my daily briefing on the war situation. German resistance was collapsing on all fronts. There could be no doubt that the end of the war in Europe was in sight.
On April the 21st, our troops reached the Berlin Autobahn ring.
The boss could still not believe that the Russians were at the gates.
You will see. The Russians will suffer the biggest defeat, the bloodiest defeat in their history before the gates of Berlin.
Karl Koller, Chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe.
April the 22nd, 1945.
This date marks the end of the Third Reich for me.
I won't leave Berlin again. I will defend the city till the end. Either I lead the fighting around the capital of the Reich, or I perish with my soldiers in Berlin and die in the battle for the symbol of the Reich.
In the small anteroom, Hitler stands motionless. In a distant and commanding manner, he calls out,
"Get changed at once. In 1 hour, an aircraft will come and take you to the south. Everything is lost, hopelessly lost."
My dearest Hertha, these will be the very last lines and thus the last sign of life from me. I shall die as I have lived. It's no burden, you know that. Warm greetings to all, and kisses, yours, Eva.
Hitler capitulated.
April the 23rd, 1945, Monday.
The Soviet 8th Guards Army joined the 1st Ukrainian Front near Johannesthal Airport the same day. One more step remained. Berlin had to be taken, and the war ended. Vasily Chuikov, General.
Russians took Berlin and cut the heart from Hitler's empire. And he himself, who planned to rule the earth from pole to pole, vanished like smoke among the falling walls.
And the last great European battle. Nearly $10 billion worth of American aid poured into the Soviet Union during the war. American heavy bombers based on Soviet soil. American and Soviet troops meeting on the German River. All parts of the Allied effort.
On the 25th of April, with the Red Army surrounding the city, Soviet and American troops finally met up at Torgau on the Elbe.
The fragmentation of Germany into two parts was completed. The German army dissolved before our eyes.
April the 27th, 1945. We still have radio contact with Berlin, where the enemy has fought its way into the city center. One's heart bleeds during these conversations. It's like the Battle of the Visigoths at Vesuvius. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Armed Forces High Command, Flensburg.
The commander of the citadel, Mohnke, was often with the troops on the front line. On April the 29th, he reported to Hitler that to the north, the Russians were a short distance away from Weidendammer Bridge, to the east in Lustgarten, to the south near Potsdamer Platz and the Air Ministry, and to the west in Tiergarten. That was only a few hundred meters from the Chancellery. When Hitler asked him,
"How long can you hold out?"
he answered, 20 to 24 hours at the most.
April the 29th, 1945. Sometime around 11 p.m.
Mussolini had been killed by Italian partisans.
The Führer comes up to me, shakes my hand and asks,
"Have you rested a little, my child? I'd like to dictate something. Get the shorthand pad." "My private will and testament. I have now decided, before the closing of my earthly career, to take the girl who, after many years of faithful friendship, entered the practically besieged city of her own free will in order to share her destiny with me as my wife."
April the 29th, 1945. Hitler only wanted to make Eva Frau Hitler to preserve convention at the end. Above all, for Eva's parents. The Browns wouldn't have to live with the shame of their daughter having died as a concubine.
My political testament. I die with a happy heart in the face of the immeasurable deeds and achievements of our soldiers at the front, our women at home, the achievements of our farmers and workers, and the efforts, unique in history, of our youth who bear my name. In order to give the German people a government composed of honourable men, I appoint the following members of the new cabinet as leaders of the nation. President of the Reich, Dönitz. Chancellor of the Reich, Dr. Goebbels. Issued in Berlin, this 29th day of April 1945, 4:00 a.m. Adolf Hitler.
When I left my observation post on April the 30th to go to the army staff, Marshal Georgy Zhukov called and asked, "Is there hope that we will have fully cleaned up Berlin by May Day?" Vasily Chuikov.
On April the 30th, 1945, around noon, Bormann told me that Hitler's decision was now firm.
Valet Heinz Linger reports the hour of his death as 3:50 p.m. He says he noted this time from a grandfather clock in the anteroom to Hitler's office. Adjutant Otto Günsche cites his final hour as 3:30 p.m. He said he'd looked at his watch.
On this day at 2:25 p.m., the troops of the First Shock Army took over most of the Reichstag building.
Telegram in secret Navy encryption. In the place of the current Reichsmarschall Göring, the Führer appoints you, Grand Admiral, as his replacement. You should undertake at once all measures that arise from the present situation. Bormann. Announcement Hamburg Radio, May the 1st, 1945. It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism and for Germany.
We were going towards the Danish frontier, Bremenfeld, then Hamburg. The rot was setting in. 1.5 million surrendered in the north. The fighting was nearly over and our job was beginning. We'd been training a long time for the administration of Germany, and we were prepared for plenty of trouble. Sabotage, passive resistance, or perhaps something more violent. You know, werewolves in sheep's clothing. But as it turned out, most of them were docile and did what they were told. They seemed healthy, well-fed. Their disease was in their minds. A German woman, looking at what was left of her town, said to me, "If only you'd given up in 1940, none of this need have happened."
I'm just like the soldiers here, who look at the beautiful countryside, use the super modern comforts of their buildings, and wonder why the Germans wanted anything more. Lee Miller, US war photographer.
Less than a month after President Roosevelt's death, Germany surrendered.
The German Wehrmacht capitulated on May the 8th, 1945.
After the Nazi surrender, Ike ordered a ceasefire.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
Victory in Europe brought worldwide celebration. Winston Churchill called it the greatest outburst of joy in the history of mankind.
May the 8th, 1945, VE Day. After nearly 6 years of war, victory in Europe was a reality.
To the nations of Europe, he represents the Britain of their trust. In France,
As elder statesman, Churchill commanded the world stage. He warned of Russia's threat and called on Europe to unite, reveling in the adulation of the millions he'd helped liberate.
Facing Air Chief Marshal Tedder and Marshal Zhukov is a conquered German general.
Only when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the German surrender in Berlin on the 9th of May 1945 did the Latvian Legion lay down its arms.
It was not disloyalty, but rather his suicide that put an end to Hitler's organization. This man who rose out of nothing at a time when it was longing, he formulated a doctrine based on a mixture of fascism and race theory. The totalitarian system allowed him to act without restraint. The military gave him the trump cards of lightning attacks. All of this led to repression, and that, in turn, led to these crimes.
As the Japanese Empire crumbled in 1945, the rising sun gathered its forces for a last stand against an expected U.S. invasion at the island of Okinawa. Throughout March of 1945, the American Navy closed in on Okinawa, 350 miles from Japan. For 2 weeks, the Americans pounded the island with a barrage 20 times heavier than the bombardment of Nazi defenses on D-Day. Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. 170,000 American combat troops head toward shore, relatively unopposed. Soldier landing safely. The Japanese strategy was similar to the one used on other Japanese-held islands. They waited and baited the Americans to come inland, unwilling to waste any of their 100,000 troops on Okinawa's beaches. The Japanese decided to make their stand at two ends of the island, but the strongest defensive position was at the Shuri line to the south, where they could hide in caves and hills. Here they would make their final stand. The Americans progressed slowly, yard by yard, house by house, as the Japanese slowly fell back toward the south end of the island. Like two tired fighters, both sides pounded each other into exhaustion. The battle was brutal. What the GIs thought might be easy became more difficult day by day, as the Japanese plan of luring the American soldiers into killing zones was put into effect. Thousands of Allied soldiers were lost during the first month, and the end seemed nowhere in sight. U.S. General Simon B. Buckner faced increasing pressure to end the battle on Okinawa, so that the ships supplying the Marines would not remain vulnerable to Japanese attack. Buckner himself would die on the island, a victim of mortar fire. The American offensive had been slowed to a walk, and the casualties continued to mount. It would take 4 days and 2,600 U.S. casualties to finally pierce the Japanese line at Sugarloaf Hill. As June wore on, the Japanese wore out. They fell back to a final position on the craggy south end of the island. With the island heavily mined, every step was precarious. Hand grenades and flamethrowers are used to flush out the enemy as the Marines continue searching every cave, every nook and cranny for Japanese soldiers. and the killing continues on both sides of battle. Victory is no longer in doubt for the Americans. But the question remains, how high will the body count go before the island is finally considered secure? GIs frequently give a hand to otherwise helpless civilians caught in the crossfire of battle. More than 30,000 Okinawans, mostly island farmers, were killed or wounded during the battle. But American troops earned the trust of those islanders who survived. By the middle of June, the end is finally in sight. The entire island has become a battle zone, its cities in ruin. The Japanese continue to fight to the death, forcing the American soldiers to treat every tree or cave as potentially harboring a Japanese sniper. On June 21st, after 82 days of battle, the Americans finally reached the southern tip of Okinawa. And the Japanese finally surrendered. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 110,000 soldiers and civilians had perished. When word of the surrender was officially acknowledged, Japanese soldiers emerged from the brush and laid down their weapons. The empire had suffered its largest loss of life and worst defeat in history. July 4th, 1945. This is one 4th of July that Americans on Okinawa would not be celebrating but would always remember. More than 12,000 Americans lost their lives during the 82 days of fighting on this small Pacific island. The tremendous casualties faced by both sides in the Battle of Okinawa helped persuade U.S. President Harry Truman to postpone the invasion of Japan and offer the Japanese a chance to surrender.
June the 18th, Washington. General Eisenhower is given a hero's welcome after his victory in Europe. In the White House that day, Truman is asked to approve his Joint Chiefs of Staff's plans to invade Japan in November. By this time, the battle for Okinawa is almost over. 12,000 Americans had died. For the Japanese, 100,000 died.
Stalin asked Zhukov, "Have you forgotten how to ride a horse?" Zhukov said he could still ride. "Thank God," Stalin said, "because you will have to take the salute at the victory parade." Rokossovsky commanded the parade.
When Truman sailed to Europe on July the 7th for his meeting with Stalin and Churchill, he knew through intercepted messages that Japan wanted an end to the war but non-conditional surrender. Stalin and Molotov refused to see the Japanese ambassador before they left Moscow for the last Big Three meeting for 10 years. Truman and Burns decided not to modify the unconditional surrender formula by offering the Japanese the chance to keep their emperor. Prime Minister Suzuki announced that Japan would ignore the ultimatum. Perhaps Russia would save Japan's honor. On August the 6th, 2 days before the Russians had said they would attack the Japanese, the Enola Gay set off on its 1,500-mile journey. At 8:15, on the morning of August the 6th, the Enola Gay, flying at 32,000 feet, released its bomb over Hiroshima. 70,000 had died in Hiroshima. 8 hours later, exactly 3 months after the defeat of Germany, just as Stalin had promised, Russia attacked the Japanese army in Manchuria. Japanese hopes of Russian mediation, American hopes of finishing the war before Russia became involved. Later that same morning, the Americans dropped a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki, killed 60,000 people. At noon on August the 15th, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time. The war, he told them, has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Moreover, the enemy has begun to use a new and most cruel bomb. We must, therefore, endure the unendurable. The morning of September the 2nd, 1945, the United States battleship Missouri is anchored in Tokyo Bay.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.